There are cities in history that seem to have stopped mid-breath, a meal left half-eaten on the table, shadows of people frozen in their last moments, and streets sealed under ash for nearly 2,000 years. These aren't legends, they're the real remains of Pompeii buried in fire, uncovered in stone, and still filled with questions historians can't fully answer. Why did so many stay when the mountain warned them to run? What really happened in those final hours? Chaos, silence, or both? And how much of Pompeii is already lost forever, erased before we could uncover it? From warnings ignored to bodies preserved in ash, from graffiti on the walls to scrolls burned into blackened rolls. Tonight we'll explore 101 Pompeii mysteries of a city frozen in fire. So take a slow breath, because before names are written and timelines arranged, imagine the instant itself, streets falling silent, roofs collapsing, and a city locked in fire and ash, a world frozen, waiting centuries to be uncovered. You begin with a date that anchors everything, 79 AD. Historians converge on that year because two surviving letters by Pliny the Younger describe the eruption that destroyed Pompeii and nearby towns, while his uncle sailed to investigate. Those texts, synced with archaeological layers, lock the event to Emperor Titus's reign. This is our first major fact in this block. Pompeii was buried in 79 AD, under a cascade of pumice, ash and surges from Mount Vesuvius. Archaeologists note deposit profiles across the city, meters of lapillian courtyards, collapsed roofs under ash loads, and above that, surge horizons that cut through doorways, showing a lethal sequence that entombed streets, shops and bodies. The year is firm even if the exact month remains debated, because coin finds and inscriptions are consistent with that narrow window. You hold that anchor point while the rest of the puzzle arranges around it. From there, the city disappears from view for more than 16 centuries, shielded by the very disaster that ended it. What follows is our second key fact. Pompeii's systematic rediscovery began in 1748 under the Bourbon monarchy at Naples, after earlier tunneling and Herculaneum in the 1730s hinted at a buried world along the bay. Engineers, soldiers and draftsmen, working first as treasure seekers, then increasingly as recorders, lifted frescoes, mapped walls and cleared streets that no one had walked since antiquity. Historians point out that the name Pompeii only gradually reattached to the ruins as inscriptions surfaced. Before that, the countryside held little more than a memory of an old catastrophe. You can mark the shift from rumour and tunnels to open trenches, drawn plans, and the first glimpses of a Roman town arrested mid-action. The modern story of Pompeii starts here, in pits of curiosity, widened into archaeology. What those early and later excavations exposed leads to the third fact that defines Pompeii in the historical imagination. Its preservation is uniquely comprehensive among Roman sites. The city's entombment created sealed contexts, where organic and delicate materials often survive: carbonized bread loaves, stamped with baker's seals, baskets, wooden shutters, even impressions of textiles, ash-packed interiors, tightly enough that voids left by decomposed bodies could later be cast in plaster, preserving posture and clothing folds as negative space. Archaeologists stress that this does not mean everything was saved, yet relative to most classical towns, the cross-section is astonishing. Street ruts, electoral graffiti, shop counters with embedded jars, thermopolia with soot-blackened walls, garden beds traced by root cavities, and lararia painted with household gods in situ. You can hear the consistent refrain. Pompeii shows not just monuments, but the habitual menus, price lists, schedules, quarrels, frozen where they occurred. That breadth lets historians reconstruct work rhythms, traffic rules, diet, decor, and social ties with rare granularity. But if that were the whole story, it would be simple. Yet the fourth fact complicates the picture and sets up the stakes to come. Scholars debate whether we have already lost more than we have preserved. The first 2 centuries of digging were not guided by today's standards. Tunnels collapsed contexts, frescoes were detached without recording stratigraphy, and countless small finds, bones, seeds, cheap ceramics were discarded as rubble. Exposure itself is an eroder. Once roofs and plaster met air and rain, painted walls flaked, pigments chalked, and mortar joints failed. Some rooms were stripped in antiquity by survivors returning to salvage. Others were emptied in the 1700s to stock royal collections. Historians also note the silent losses baked into the catastrophe. Heat carbonized papyri in Herculaneum, but incinerated many organic objects outright in Pompeii. Ash preserved shapes but not voices, leaving gaps in the written record that no trench can fill. The debate is not pessimism for its own sake. It is a caution that every interpretive leap must account for attrition, ancient, early modern, and modern. You, as a careful observer, have to balance wonder with skepticism. When you see a kitchen, you ask what the clearance teams removed. When you read a wall slogan, you ask how many never survived. When a cast shocks you into empathy, you ask what that posture can and cannot prove about the instant of death. Historians emphasize method. They cross-check Pliny's narrative against tephra layers. They date coins against imperial issues. They read building repairs for evidence of earlier earthquakes. And they collate bread stamps with bakers named in electoral notices. The trained habit is to treat Pompeii as a dataset as much as a spectacle. That habit tempers the claim of uniqueness with the admission of uneven survival. It is why new trenches are rare and targeted, why non-invasive surveys are preferred, and why conservation now runs in parallel with interpretation. You are guided toward questions that resist final answers, not because the past is unknowable, but because its archive is partial by nature. So the frame of this entire story stands on 4 legs. First, the eruption year 79 AD fixes the chronology. Second, the rediscovery in 1748 ushers the city back into scholarly sight. Third, the mode of burial creates a preservation spectrum, unlike almost any other Roman town, yielding a living texture of daily habits. Fourth, the archive is wounded by ancient salvage, by early extraction, and by modern weathering, forcing caution about completeness. Each leg supports and limits what follows. You'll keep returning to them as you weigh claims about warnings, about the day's timeline, about caste interpretations, about social stratification, read from floor plans, about diets inferred from drains. This measured stance is what lets historians move from spectacle to evidence, from anecdote to pattern. Because if these 4 facts stand, what follows is unavoidable. You must ask not only how Pompeii died, but whether some residents understood the danger before it struck, and why they stayed or fled when they did. That mismatch between signals and choices is exactly what opens the door to the next clue. You stand at the hinge between routine and catastrophe. By looking backward 17 years, contemporary authors and excavations converge on the same prelude. A powerful earthquake struck Campania in 62 AD, damaging temples, houses, and infrastructure across Pompeii and its neighbours. That shock matters because it reframes the later disaster not as a bolt from a clear sky, but as another act in a restless landscape. Archaeologists track collapsed colonnades, patched walls, and reworked facades as material after images of that quake. Inscriptions and paintings commemorate rebuilding. Coin hoards close around the 60s and 70s, consistent with an economy jolted and then set to repair. When you walk a reconstructed street plan, you notice odd asymmetries, doorways narrowed by expedient masonry, capitals reused in secondary contexts, roofs that show mixed timbers from different phases, all signatures of a city still healing when Vesuvius resumed its conversation with the crust. From this background, a second pattern takes shape, and it is stubbornly specific. By 79 AD, repair was unfinished. Excavators describe scaffolding holes preserved in plaster, stacks of roof tiles waiting to be laid, and construction debris sealed beneath the eruption deposits. Within several insulae, lime kilns set up in city blocks were converting marble fragments from damaged buildings into mortar, an expedient more typical of post-disaster economies than of steady-state urban life. Public monuments tell the same story at civic scale. Forums, baths, and temples show piecemeal restoration, some shrines freshly refurbished, others stripped to cores or ringed by temporary supports. The pattern exposes prioritization under constraint, elites directing resources to visible nodes, while peripheral spaces lagged. You are watching a city negotiate trade-offs, where to spend, where to stall, when time ran out. A third thread runs through both text and strata. Earth tremors were frequent in the run-up to the eruption, and, crucially, had been normalized. Pliny the Younger, writing to Tacitus, remarks that quakes in Campania were common and not especially alarming. That line is a key to mindset. If small shocks were routine, the threshold for fear rose, and prudence meant carrying on. Reports of wells sloshing, animals agitated, or faint ashfalls belong to the broader catalogue of volcanic precursors known in comparable settings. What historians can pin down with confidence is that a swarm of minor shocks likely accompanied magma intrusion and pressurization of the system. Yet people worked, shopped, and cooked through the rattling. Habituation blunted urgency. When the earth often shivers and then calms, the practiced response is endurance rather than evacuation. If that were the whole story, it would be simple, but a fourth line of evidence complicates the picture and forces attention to individual choices. The material record yields signs that some residents sensed danger and prepared to move, while others treated the day as ordinary. Bread was left rising in ovens when buried. Counters remained stocked in thermopolia. Amphorae stood upright in storerooms. Coins sat in tills as if awaiting customers. At the same time, certain houses present valuables gathered as if for departure, and streets near gates have yielded clusters of victims suggesting late attempts to flee. Interpreting those juxtapositions divides scholarly emphasis. One reading holds that the daylight hours of Pumice Fall were survivable, and that many citizens used them to collect possessions or shelter, misreading the hazard curve. Another underscores how swiftly roof failures under lapilli loads and later surges turned a manageable ashfall into an inescapable sequence, making recognition almost moot. You are weighing misperception against narrowing options. The texts explain attitudes, and the stratigraphy explains outcomes. A final inference follows from the unevenness of the bodies and belongings. Some inhabitants did escape before the fatal surges, though the proportions remain uncertain. Demographic estimates for Pompeii range widely because the living population and the number present on the day are both contested. Excavations have identified victims within and beyond the walls, but the tally is fragmentary by nature. Large areas remain unexcavated. Early digs removed, remains without modern documentation, and post-eruption salvage altered contexts. Counter-evidence for mass entrapment lies in absence as much as presence. Inventories of houses with valuables missing, doorways left open, and rural villas showing signs of hasty abandonment imply that routes out of the city were used. Historians cross-check these hints with patterns from Herculaneum, where shoreline concentrations reveal a different geography of decision, and with Pliny's narrative of regional flight under ashfall and darkness. The careful consensus is that escape occurred but not universally. Pathways were unevenly viable, and social position, location, and timing shaped survival. Taken together, these 5 strands give you a coherent prelude. A city still repairing from 62 AD preserved the scars on its facades and the improvisations in its rebuilding. Civic and domestic spaces show how restoration coexisted with delay, how resources pooled around prestige projects, and how practical lime kilns in residential blocks gnawed old marble into new mortar. A populace schooled by frequent tremors treated shaking as background noise and prioritized continuity. Signals about escalation were mixed. In some rooms the day paused long enough to gather jewelry and strongboxes, while on many counters workday routines still dictated the arrangement of tools and stock. Partial evacuations threaded outward through gates and along roads that would later choke with debris. This balance matters because it sets the initial conditions of the disaster itself. When the plume rose and pumice began to fall, the city enacted habits learned over a decade and a half of post-quake resilience. Sweep thresholds, brace beams, keep the ovens going, protect property, and wait for tremors to ease. As hours passed, ash loads accumulated and choices narrowed. The step from routine to crisis was a slope rather than a switch, and the steepness of that slope varied by district, house type, and time of day. Early casualties cluster beneath porticos and roofs that failed under lapilli. Later ones shift toward doorways and open spaces as surges advanced. The prelude's lesson, normalize tremors, manage ash, keep working, became a liability once physical thresholds were crossed that no living memory could calibrate. For the narrative that follows, this staging is not a flourish, but a method. It explains why confidence persisted through the morning, why many people stayed to shore up carpentry or bundle valuables, and why the boundary between sound judgment and fatal delay moved hour. It also sharpens the hour-by-hour reconstruction to come, because ash layers collapse patterns, and victim distributions double as timestamps. With the preconditions clear, unfinished repairs, normalized tremors, mixed recognition, partial flight, you can now follow the next 12 to 18 hours with a tighter lens, the plume, the pumice, the collapses, and the surges, each leaving a measurable trace, and each tightening the city's narrowing margins. You can follow the day almost hour by hour by stitching together Pliny the Younger's letters with the order of deposits across the city. A tall umbrella-shaped column rose from Vesuvius, and driven by winds from the northwest, bent toward the southeast, blanketing Pompeii beneath a steady fall of pumice. Excavators read the opening act directly in the ground, a lower bed of light white lapilli, then a switch to darker grey lapilli as the eruption column evolved. Shop thresholds, garden beds, and stairwells fill in the same order, which lets you track the tempo of accumulation as if watching a slow clock. This stratigraphic rhythm matches the literary one, a long fallout phase, then a change in behaviour that the geology records as something far more dangerous than stones from the sky. Duration becomes the first fixed frame you need. Comparing Pliny's timing afternoon onset, night of fear, morning of flight, with measured thicknesses and grain sizes across the bay, yields a window of roughly 18 to 24 hours from first column to final choking surges. That span is not guesswork, it's inferred from growth curves of deposit thickness away from the volcano, from the sorting of pumice clasts in courtyards and streets, and from roof collapse horizons that appear after a known depth has loaded tiles and timbers. When you see a floor sealed by about 2 meters of lapilli with a collapse layer tucked inside, you are looking at a timestamp. Enough hours had passed for pumice to rise to eaves, push rafters, and bring ceilings down before the next phase arrived. Roof failure is the second recurring signal that anchors the city's timeline. Pumice behaves deceptively. Individual clasts are light, but falling in their millions, they act like a slow avalanche. Archaeologists document rooms where rafters punched into kitchens, porticos snapped along their outer lines, and courtyards filled to windowsills, while people tried to clear entrances with shovels and baskets. The pattern is consistent across multiple insulines. Early victims under beams and tiles, later victims closer to thresholds and streets. Builders had designed Pompeian roofs for rain and sun, not for hours of stone hail. The lapilli worked into gutters and downspouts, added weight to pitched surfaces, and once water cistern covers were breached, cascaded inward through infrastructure that normally kept houses comfortable. You can tell which districts struggled first by the angle of pumice wedges against walls, and by where props and makeshift braces have been found fallen in place. Then comes the moment when the eruption changed character. The towering column began to collapse in pulses, sending pyroclastic density currents, ground-hugging, superheated clouds of gas, ash, and fragmenting rock downslope. Volcanologists reconstruct 6 such surges from cross-bedded, fine-grained layers that drape over the pumice, each with its own fingerprint of temperature, speed, and direction. Not all of them reached Pompeii. The earlier ones expended themselves closer to the cone or tracked different corridors. The later ones did arrive, sweeping low places and open streets, racing through doorways, and leaving a thin, deadly blanket that differs from the coarser lapilli below. In houses that had survived the night of Pomus, this new phase erased the margin for improvisation. Doors that had been kept ajar for sweeping became inlets. Courtyards that had provided breathing space turned into traps, where you see charred wood veneers, warped metal fittings, and a dusting of fine ash over rooms already burdened by lapilli. You are seeing the passage of those currents. This shift in hazard raises the hardest interpretive question. What, in those last minutes, killed the people who remained? For years, the default image was suffocation in ash, supported by casts that show mouths open and hands raised. More recent forensic and volcanological work emphasizes lethal heat. At Herculaneum, closer to the source, bones and wood carry signatures of extreme temperatures that would have caused instantaneous death. At Pompeii, some deposits also indicate surges hot enough to induce thermal shock. Historians distinguish carefully here. In many parts of Pompeii, ash inhalation and roof collapse during the fallout phase certainly caused fatalities, and casts preserved bodies under beams and tiles where breath would have failed long before a surge arrived. In other sectors, especially where a fine surge layer caps the pumice without an intervening collapse horizon, the thermal hypothesis better fits the evidence. The scene-by-scene answer depends on exact position, deposit type, and structural context, which is why the scholarly literature speaks in plural mechanisms, not a single mechanism, linked to the city's microgeographies. The deposits themselves are the city's chronicle, and provide the method for untying these knots. You can think of each layer as a page: lower white pumice with coarse clasts, upper grey pumice with slightly different mineral mix and grain size, collapse lenses of broken tile and plaster, thin surge drapes with cross laminations that point the flow direction. Archaeologists align these pages between houses, streets, and open spaces to build a synchronized map of the day. Where a bakery oven sits beneath a certain thickness of lapilli, with no surge cap, you know it succumbed during fallout. Where a skeleton lies in a corridor with a thin, fine ash mantle and no roof debris above, you know heat and ash cloud arrived before the ceiling did. Even small details like the orientation of pumice clasts around door frames or the sifting of ash through roof tiles feed the reconstruction. When hundreds of such micro timestamps are plotted, a citywide timeline emerges that matches Pliny's broad strokes while filling the gaps his letters cannot. Working along that composite timeline, you can narrate the day with greater precision than a simple morning-night-morning scheme. Early afternoon, the column rises and bright pumice begins to fall. By evening, the grey phase signals changes in the conduit and plume dynamics. Through the night, roofs groan and some districts collapse inward, while others remain serviceable. Toward dawn, the first of the later surges reaches sectors of Pompeii, racing along streets and through peristyles. By mid-morning, additional pulses compound the damage, and the thin, fine ash caps in many rooms mark the end. The evidence for movement during the night, buckets by doorways, bundles of goods near thresholds, coins gathered into small purses, fits this cadence. The evidence for final attempts at flight, clusters at intersections, bodies aligned with gates, appears at the moment when collapsing structures and surges converged. This hour-scale reading also clarifies why different neighborhoods present different deathscapes. Topography and street layout channeled flows, building density modulated, where pumice accumulated fastest, roof types and maintenance status from the post-62 AD rebuilding wave dictated which beams failed first. Open atria acted as both relief valves and funnels, depending on wind direction and surge height. A house on a higher street with an intact roof might have ridden out the fallout, only to be opened by a brief but lethal current. A shop under a heavy tile roof in a narrow lane might have failed hours earlier under the lapilli alone. Such variation is why historians caution against single-sentence explanations and instead insist on matching mechanisms to micro-contexts. When you compare Pompeii to Herculaneum, across this same frame, the contrasts reinforce the method. Herculaneum's proximity to the volcano and its position relative to the flows brought earlier and hotter currents, which is why carbonized wood intact upper stories, and massed shoreline victims define that site, whereas Pompeii's thicker pumice blanket and later arriving surges produce a different order of deposits and a different distribution of casualties. The common denominator is the sequence: fallout that loads and weakens, then currents that finish what weight and time began. By the time the final surge settled and the column waned, the city's archive was sealed by its own physics. Pumice pinned objects where they stood, collapse layers froze rooms mid-failure, and fine ash laid a uniform veil over the last positions of bodies. Everything you will examine in the next section, the postures of casts, the clusters of people in rooms and streets, the tools and valuables gathered or abandoned, make sense only against this clock built from stones and dust. The timeline does not tell you what someone felt in a final glance or breath, but it does tell you when rooms became untenable, when doors turned into inlets, and when a choice to stay became a death sentence, measured in minutes rather than hours. And that is the threshold you now cross, from the physics of the day to the human geometry inside houses and along streets, where plaster and bone preserve not only the order of events, but the last, fraught decisions people made as the city turned from ashfall to fire. You step from the broad clock of deposits into rooms where the shapes of people remain, and the narrative becomes intimate without ceasing to be forensic. What you are looking at when you stand before a figure from Pompeii is not a statue but a void that once held a body, surrounded by ash that set like tender concrete. In the mid-19th century, excavators working under Giuseppe Fiorelli realized that these hollow cavities could be filled with liquid plaster to recover the surface of what had disappeared. The technique stabilized fragile spaces and produced a three-dimensional record of posture, clothing folds, sandals, belts, and even the weave of fabric pressed against skin. From that point onward, casts turned scattered cavities into an archive of final positions, making the last minutes legible to the eye. The reason the method works lies in the chemistry of the disaster. Fine ash and pumice settled around bodies while they were still warm, wrapping limbs and faces in a close matrix. As tissues decomposed, gases escaped through pores in the deposit, and an envelope formed that roughly held the contours of skin and garments. When plaster flows into that negative, it takes the exact shape left behind, and when it sets, excavators can peel back the surrounding ash and reveal a form. In some cases, the residue of hair, leather, or jewelry remained in place, becoming part of the cast's surface. In others, bones are still inside, and modern imaging can see them. The result is simultaneously scientific and unsettling, a forensic mold that reintroduces human scale into a catastrophe, often told by meters of ash and the vocabulary of surges. Once you accept casts as records rather than sculptures, the spatial arrangements begin to speak. Certain houses yielded single figures near doorways, collapsed as if pushing outward from a room where pumice was rising. Others contain pairs or small clusters, grouped in corners or along interior walls, suggesting plans to shelter inside until the fallout ceased. Courtyards sometimes hold bodies in lines where escape routes narrowed, and streets just off the main gates have produced clusters aligned toward exits. One of the most evocative sights is the so-called Garden of the Fugitives, where a line of adults and children was found in an orchard along the southern edge of the city, their bodies falling as a unit in open air. Another is a grand residence, popularly known as the House of the Golden Bracelet, where a woman with jewelry and a child were found with other victims near a doorway, implying an attempt to leave with valuables in the final interval before conditions collapsed. Excavators in the eastern districts have reported groups of 3 to 5 found together in rooms that read as hasty refuges, storage spaces, service corridors, or cellar entries, confirming that many households improvised within the architecture they knew best. Patterns like these allow cautious inferences about behavior without drifting into melodrama. People gathered kin, servants, and neighbors. They moved toward places that felt safest, interior rooms away from falling tiles, doorways that promised air, courtyards that seemed less likely to trap smoke. In shops, bodies appear behind counters, where work had continued through the ashfall. In workshops, casts are found with tools nearby, suggesting owners who tried to secure livelihoods before abandoning posts. The very act of grouping is revealing. Archaeologists note that triads and quartets appear more often than crowds inside houses, which matches the layout of domestic rooms and the rhythm of household life, and that larger clusters tend to form near thresholds or in open spaces where multiple paths converged. The social landscape written in electoral graffiti and property boundaries reappears here at the end as family units and work teams try to navigate a city turning unfamiliar under weight and heat. Every gesture preserved in plaster tempts interpretation, and this is exactly where method has to be strict. The familiar boxer's stance, elbows flexed, fingers curled, head tilted, does not necessarily record fear or resistance in any simple way. Forensic specialists explain that exposure to high heat can dehydrate tissues rapidly and cause muscles and tendons to contract, bringing limbs into a defensive-looking pose after death. That means some dramatic postures may be thermally induced rather than volitional. At the same time, there are casts whose positions are more consistent with collapse under load or disorientation in ash. Prone figures beneath rafters and tile, bodies curled beside interior steps, individuals fallen on thresholds where a final sweep of pumice or a sudden dimming of light might have altered balance. Each case demands the same pairing of geological layer and anatomical reading. The plaster shows you a pose. The deposit around it tells you how that pose likely came to be. Because these bodies were entombed in different phases of the disaster, the mechanisms of death vary across the city. In rooms sealed below thick lapillae, with no fine ash cap, many victims likely succumb to roof failure or to suffocation in dense, dust-laden air while trying to dig or shelter. In sectors where a thin, cross-laminated surge layer blankets interiors directly above the pumice, without intervening collapse, lethal heat becomes harder to deny, even at a distance from the cone. The debate among historians and volcanologists over dominant causes of death is not a contest for a single answer, but an effort to match mechanism to microcontext. Herculaneum skeletons, showing traces consistent with extreme temperatures near the shore, anchor one end of the spectrum. Pompeii's mix of early collapses and later fine ash drapes anchors the other. The most responsible conclusion is plural. In Pompeii, some died of structural failure or asphyxiation during the long fallout, and others perished in surges that arrived when the city's defences were already compromised. The casts themselves are not the only witnesses inside the ash. Underneath many lie the bones that shaped them, and recent scans using medical CT and industrial radiography have been used to examine skeletons without breaking the plaster. Researchers report pelvis morphology that can confirm sex, dental wear that hints at diet, vertebral changes consistent with heavy labour, and developmental markers that fix age ranges. In a few cases, healed fractures or degenerative conditions add a layer of biography to a figure whose face we can see, but whose name we will never know. When those interior observations are paired with items found in immediate association, buckles, footwear, a tool pouch, a string of beads, they sketch a life with more precision than posture alone can offer. That move from form to identity begins to bridge toward the next questions you will ask about the citizens themselves. At the same time, there are important cautions built into the medium. Early casts were sometimes reinforced with iron rods or mixed with coarser materials that can obscure bone on scans. In some periods, parts of cavities were missed or filled in stages, producing seams that complicate anatomical reading. The moment of casting captures an outline, but can slightly distort small details, especially fingers or facial features, if the ash was damp or the fill too forceful. Scholars emphasize that the emotional power of these figures should not outrun what the evidence allows. Empathy is appropriate, but inference must be anchored. It helps to treat each cast as one layer in a file that also includes the room's stratigraphy, the building's damaged state from earlier quakes, the furniture imprints in the floor, and the street's exposure to surges. The social dimension reframes what might otherwise be seen as isolated tragedies. Groupings often pair adults with children, masters with servants, workmates with workmates. Jewellery appears with women and men alike. Coins are found with a range of individuals. Keys show up in more than one context, implying attempts to secure or reopen property. In several houses near the city's edges, valuables had been consolidated before the end, while in others, storerooms were left stocked, as if the owners intended to return after a brief interruption. When archaeologists map these details against where castes occur, patterns emerge. Families tending to stay together until movement became impossible, workers staying with tools until the hazard shifted, neighbours pooling in familiar spaces that felt safest because they always had been. The final minutes are not chaos in the abstract. They are structured by the habits of domestic life and the architecture that shaped those habits. Even the absences are instructive. Rooms that might have held more people contain none, perhaps because occupants fled earlier, perhaps because the spaces failed too quickly. Streets you might expect to be crowded are empty in the archaeological record, maybe because a surge passed there before clusters could form, maybe because another path offered better shelter at the crucial hour. When historians speak of uncertainty in the proportions who escaped, they point partly to these gaps, which are as meaningful as any line of fallen bodies. What is certain, taking the casts together with the stratigraphy, is that decision-making continued deep into the event. To brace a beam one more time, to gather a child, to choose an interior corridor over a street already drifting with pumice, to carry a coffer or leave it, the casts preserve those decisions at their last possible instant. Standing back from the individual rooms, you can see how this body of evidence supports two complementary truths. First, the casting technique created one of the most direct human archives in classical archaeology, allowing historians to correlate posture, place, and deposit with a precision that few other sites permit. Second, the very immediacy of that archive invites over-reading unless it is tethered to the physics documented in the previous section. Posture alone cannot tell you cause. Grouping alone cannot tell you motive. A child beside an adult cannot tell you the relation without the rest of the file. The strength of the Pompeii record lies in the convergence of forms, layers, objects, and buildings, each constraining and clarifying the others. From here, the inquiry widens from the moment of death to the lives that preceded it. The bones inside the casts, the teeth that hold isotopic traces of early diet, the vertebrae shaped by labour, the personal items chosen or chanced upon in the last minutes, and the rooms themselves with their tools and decor, all speak to identity, age, sex, occupation, health, origin, and status. The next step is to listen beyond the pose and beyond the day, reading the people of Pompeii in the evidence they carried in their bodies and left in their houses when time stopped. The bodies sealed in ash carry more than posture. Inside their bones and around their belongings lies a record of lives interrupted. Osteological analysis has become a key to that record, because skeletons preserve markers that speak to age, sex, health, and sometimes occupation. Examination of teeth reveals growth lines that indicate childhood nutrition, enamel defects linked to episodes of illness, and wear patterns that show the consistency of diet. Archaeologists analyzing mandibles from Pompeii note heavy abrasion consistent with bread made from stone-ground flour, which contained grit that wore enamel down. Pelvic bones often clarify sex, and epiphyseal closure in long bones narrows age estimates. In some cases, degenerative changes in joints tell of repeated labor, vertebrae compressed from carrying loads, knees thickened from squatting, shoulders showing asymmetry from repetitive tool use. Each skeleton, paired with the context of the room it lay in, becomes both a medical file and a social snapshot. Jewelry provides another layer of testimony, not only to wealth but to personal choice. Excavations in residences across Pompeii frequently uncover rings, earrings, and necklaces worn at the moment of death. A striking example comes from the House of the Golden Bracelet, where a woman was found with a heavy gold armlet of exceptional craftsmanship. accompanied by a child and other victims. Such finds confirm that in the hours of fallout, some inhabitants gathered or carried their most precious possessions, planning either to leave or to guard status markers through uncertainty. Smaller items, bronze rings, glass beads, bone hairpins, appear with individuals across social classes, showing that adornment was not limited to elites. The presence of valuables in clusters with children and servants suggests group movement under household hierarchies, reinforcing the social fabric even in crisis. What jewelry survives does more than signal wealth. It records decisions about what mattered most in a moment of imminent threat. Among the bodies, certain details suggest military identity. In one case, a young man aged about 25 to 30 was found with a short sword, leading scholars to suggest he may have been a soldier stationed in the region. The sword's form matches Roman military types, and its association with a single individual buried alongside others highlights how occupations cut across the frozen cityscape. Whether stationed formally or simply a visitor, such artifacts widen the image of Pompeii beyond merchants and artisans, to include men tied to the Roman army. Historians consider this a reminder that Pompeii was not only a provincial town, but also a node in an empire sustained by military presence. The sword speaks both to the man's likely role and to the diversity of people caught in the eruption. Biological traces deepen that diversity further. Recent DNA studies of skeletal remains from Pompeii and nearby sites reveal genetic signatures that connect individuals to regions far beyond Campania. Some sequences show affinities with populations from North Africa and the Near East, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of Roman Italy. Inscriptions and freedmen records already attested to a diverse citizenry. The bones now confirm it at a molecular level. These results match the archaeological evidence of imported goods, foreign deities venerated in household shrines, and loanwords in graffiti. They also challenge any simple image of Pompeii as an insular Italian town. The eruption's victims carried in their very cells the imprint of Rome's wider networks, proving that even provincial communities were stitched into Mediterranean mobility. One of the hardest questions, though, is how many lives were actually inside Pompeii on that day. Estimates of population size swing widely, ranging from around 10,000 to as many as 20,000, and the debate remains unresolved. The number of bodies recovered so far is only a fraction of those figures, because not all districts have been excavated and many early discoveries were lost to poor documentation. Some scholars argue that thousands escaped during the initial pumice fall, thinning the numbers left for the final surges. Others contend that many victims remain buried in unexcavated zones, particularly under collapsed upper stories. The variation in estimates matters because it shapes interpretations of economy, housing density, and social organization. Whether Pompeii was a compact town of 10,000 or a bustling center of twice that population alters how historians read its markets, baths, and amphitheater. The incomplete tally of victims is itself part of the mystery that frames every cast and every skeleton. Looking across these lines of evidence, the picture of lives interrupted becomes sharper. Bones tell of youth and age, labor and illness, diets rich in bread but variable in protein. Jewelry and tools show what people chose to carry, how wealth marked bodies even in death, and how hierarchies structured final movements. Military gear appears amid civilian objects, embedding Pompeii in the reach of Roman power. DNA traces tie individuals to a wider Mediterranean, confirming that cultural diversity was lived fact, not just inscription. And unresolved numbers remind you that the story remains open, suspended between what has been uncovered and what still lies under meters of earth. The strength of this evidence is not in single dramatic finds, but in how each strand reinforces the others. A skeleton with worn teeth in a modest workshop speaks to diet and occupation. A cast with beads and a child suggests both family and status. A sword by a young man aligns with the empire's military presence. Genetic links tie these stories to regions across the sea. The city's population was as varied as its architecture, and the eruption froze that diversity in mid-breath. Historians reconstruct it not as a monolithic narrative, but as a mosaic, each tessera carved from bone, metal, or strand of DNA. What this block teaches is that Pompeii's tragedy is inseparable from Pompeii's humanity. The eruption did not merely stop time. It preserved a spectrum of identities, wealthy and poor, local and foreign, soldier and artisan, child and elder. These traces, fragile as they are, shift the focus from the catastrophe itself to the people who lived through its hours, carrying their histories in bones, in possessions, and in the choices they made when the ash began to fall. And that sets the stage for what comes next, moving from who they were to how they lived, in houses, gardens, and daily spaces that still hold the imprint of Roman habits at the moment they ceased. The ruins of Pompeii preserve not just the lives that ended there, but the spaces where those lives unfolded. Houses are the most eloquent of these witnesses, revealing both the luxury of the elite and the practical routines of more modest families. At the grandest scale stands the House of the Faun, a residence occupying an entire city block with multiple atria, peristyles, and mosaic floors. Its Alexander mosaic, depicting a battle between Alexander the Great and Darius, illustrates how the Pompeian elite borrowed imagery from Hellenistic culture to assert refinement and prestige. This building was more than a private dwelling. It was a stage on which status was displayed to clients and guests, proof that architecture itself served as a political instrument. Even beyond such exceptional cases, the architecture of an ordinary Pompeian house centered on the atrium. This open hall admitted light and rain through a central opening and directed water into a basin below, from which it could be collected for household use. Surrounding rooms opened onto the atrium, organizing domestic life around a space that was both practical and symbolic. Here household gods were honored, visitors received, and the rhythms of family life set. The plan reflected Roman values of openness and hierarchy. A line of sight from the doorway into the heart of the house showed guests both the wealth of decoration and the sacred focus of the family. Archaeologists recognize this repeated pattern across Pompeii, confirming that it was a cultural template rather than an accident of design. Many houses extended this plan, with gardens and frescoed dining rooms. Excavations at the House of the Vetii, owned by two freedmen who had prospered, show a central peristyle garden surrounded by rooms with richly painted walls. Frescoes depict mythological scenes and elaborate ornament, proof that even men of humble origin could embrace the artistic vocabulary of Rome's elites. Gardens provided not only aesthetic pleasure, but also food, as root cavities reveal the presence of vines, fruit trees, and herbs. Dining rooms adjacent to these spaces often contained couches arranged for reclining banquets, blending natural beauty with social ritual. In this way, Pompeian houses embodied the dual role of the Roman domus as both a functional unit and a theatre of culture. Decoration extended far beyond the elite. Even modest dwellings possessed painted walls, sometimes in simple geometric designs, sometimes with imitations of marble or scenes framed in panels. Scholars classify these decorations into 4 styles that developed over time, from early imitations of masonry to elaborate architectural allusions to delicate ornamental motifs, and finally to a mix of grand and miniature scenes. The walls of Pompeii thus serve as a chronological index of changing tastes in Roman art. Importantly, their ubiquity shows that painted decoration was not a luxury confined to the wealthiest, but a shared expectation across social levels. A modest home might not boast marble floors or extensive gardens, but it still carried painted walls that projected dignity and culture. The material evidence also raises questions about how clearly social class divisions can be read in architecture. Some scholars argue that the largest villas and the smallest one-room dwellings represent clear extremes in status, but the majority of Pompeian houses fall in between, mixing modest facades with elaborately decorated interiors. Freedmen with newfound wealth could purchase houses in central areas and adorn them with costly art, blurring lines between traditional elites and social climbers. At the same time, some large houses were subdivided into apartments or shops in the years before the eruption, suggesting economic pressures or changing demographics. The correlation between house size, decoration, and social class is not absolute, and historians debate how far one can read social hierarchy directly from architecture. Within these walls, daily life left traces that humanized the ruins. Kitchens with hearths, grinding stones, and cooking vessels show the routines of meal preparation. Storage jars embedded in counters of street-side shops reveal how domestic and commercial functions intermingled. Staircases that once led to upper floors now collapsed remind us that many Pompeian houses were multi-story, with rental spaces above shops or rooms for servants tucked out of sight. Even graffiti on house walls, sometimes written by the inhabitants themselves, record jokes, political endorsements, or declarations of love, proving that these spaces were lived in, not just decorated. Taken together, the houses of Pompeii are an archive of habits. They tell us that wealth was displayed, but also that modest households participated in shared cultural forms. They show that the architecture of daily life was both practical, gathering water, cooking food, housing servants, and ideological, projecting family identity and social ambition. They remind us that social categories were porous, with freedmen imitating aristocrats and elites adapting houses after earthquakes or economic shifts. And they complicate simple readings of status by showing diversity within walls that at first glance might seem uniform. When you look closely, the houses reveal not just who owned them, but how Roman society itself functioned on a daily basis. They anchor the shift from the bones of Pompeii's people to the structures they built, decorated and inhabited, a transition that widens the frame of the catastrophe. For the disaster did not only bury individuals, it buried a built environment that embodied the values, routines, and aspirations of a Roman community. And it is in the streets outside these houses, with their stones worn by wheels and their clever adaptations to water and waste, that the next clues wait, showing that Pompeii was as organized in its infrastructure as it was expressive in its art. The houses of Pompeii opened directly onto streets, and those streets themselves carry traces as eloquent as any fresco. Walking along them today, you notice deep ruts carved into the basalt paving stones, cut by the iron-rimmed wheels of carts that passed daily through the city. These grooves are not random scars, but ordered tracks, repeating block after block, revealing how traffic circulated through the town. The depth of the ruts speaks to centuries of wear, and their alignment shows that even in antiquity, Pompeii managed movement with an efficiency familiar to modern cities. They remind you that the urban fabric was not frozen chaos, but patterned use. Crossing those streets without getting drenched required clever solutions. Large stepping stones were set at intervals across thoroughfares, standing high enough to rise above water, mud, and waste that often flowed along the roadway. Their spacing matched the width of cart axles, so wagons could pass between them without difficulty. This detail demonstrates that Pompeian engineers designed streets for multiple users at once. Pedestrians could cross without soiling sandals or togas, while carts maintained their routes unimpeded. Archaeologists note the polished edges of some stepping stones, worn smooth by countless feet, as proof of how integrated these crossings were into daily life. The stones transformed a potential hazard, the mixing of sewage, rainwater, and runoff, into a system that balanced hygiene, practicality, and urban order. The same streets doubled as drains, channeling water from houses and public buildings toward lower ground. Roofs funneled rain into courtyards, and from there it spilled into the streets, turning them into storm drains. Excavations reveal curbstones cut with slots that allowed water to exit from private dwellings into public flow. Along major avenues, the slope of the pavement shows careful grading, ensuring that water moved steadily out of the city. In effect, every street was both a road and a sewer, an integrated infrastructure that harnessed gravity to manage one of urban life's biggest challenges. The system may not have eliminated filth. Archaeological layers still show traces of waste, but it illustrates how Romans engineered multi-purpose spaces long before modern sanitation. As archaeologists mapped the wear patterns on these stones more closely, another revelation emerged. Pompeii's road network was not an anarchic sprawl, but had elements of traffic regulation. By examining the angle and direction of wheel ruts at intersections, researchers discovered that certain streets carried traffic in only one direction. In some places, cornerstones were shaved in ways that forced carts to turn a specific way, preventing jams in tight quarters. This pattern, repeated across hundreds of intersections, indicates that Pompeii had developed something akin to a one-way street system. The discovery surprised historians, who had long assumed that organized traffic management belonged to modern times. Instead, it appears that Roman urban planners anticipated the need for structured flow, imposing rules visible not in inscriptions, but in stone itself. Taken together, these features, ruts, stepping stones, drainage and directional patterns, show that Pompeii's streets were both practical and regulated. They remind you that urban order is not only about monumental buildings, but also about how carts delivered grain, how pedestrians crossed without slipping, and how waste was channeled away from crowded quarters. The city beneath the ash reveals a careful balance of engineering and habit, where improvisation coexisted with regulation. Pompeii was not just a canvas for art or a market for trade. It was a functioning organism, its streets the arteries that kept it alive. And those arteries fed into bustling economic spaces, bakeries, bars, workshops and markets that reveal just how vibrant Pompeii's commercial life was when the eruption interrupted it. The rhythm of Pompeii's streets led naturally into spaces of commerce, for this was not only a residential town, but also a working marketplace where daily transactions shaped the city's pulse. Excavations have identified more than 80 bakeries, a remarkable density that speaks to the centrality of bread in Roman diet and economy. Many of these bakeries still preserve the stone mills once turned by donkeys or slaves, their conical shapes designed to grind grain into flour. Beside them stand large brick ovens, their interiors blackened by soot, where loaves were baked in batches and stamped with seals that bore the names of bakers or owners. In one bakery, loaves carbonized by the eruption were found still inside the oven, a meal stopped in mid-preparation. These remains prove that bread was not just food, but also a regulated commodity, baked on an industrial scale and distributed across neighborhoods. Shops extended beyond bread. Thermopolia, or street bars, lined busy intersections, their counters built with embedded jars for serving hot food and drink. The plastered walls behind these counters often preserve painted motifs of cups, fish, or bread, advertising what was sold inside. Excavations of one such bar reveal amphorae for wine, jars for lentils and beans, and traces of sauces spiced with garum, the fermented fish paste so beloved by Romans. These establishments catered to artisans and labourers who lived in cramped houses without large kitchens, and they doubled as social spaces where gossip, gambling and political discussions took place. The marble counters, still intact in several thermopolia, bear the wear of thousands of elbows leaned on them, physical testimony of a culture that mixed sustenance with sociability. Economy at Pompeii was not only local, but also industrial in scope. Mills and workshops supplied goods to both townspeople and the surrounding countryside. Fulleries, laundries that used urine to clean and bleach cloth have been found, with vats, presses and basins. Evidence of dye works shows that textiles were not just cleaned, but also coloured for resale. Pottery workshops produced amphorae for wine and oil, stamped with maker's marks that identify local entrepreneurs. In one neighbourhood, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a workshop devoted to producing bronze fittings, with unfinished pieces and moulds left in place. These finds remind you that Pompeii's economy was not limited to consumption. It was a site of production where skills, labour and trade converged. Commerce extended into the political sphere through graffiti that advertised candidates for public office. Walls across Pompeii preserve electoral notices painted in red letters, urging citizens to vote for particular men. These slogans often appeared on the facades of shops and taverns, suggesting that business owners offered their walls as political billboards. Inscriptions reveal bakers, innkeepers, and guilds endorsing candidates, a sign that commerce and politics were intertwined. The very visibility of these notices in busy streets shows how the economic landscape doubled as a civic one, where buying bread or drinking wine also meant absorbing political messages. Despite this abundance of evidence, historians debate the exact scale of Pompeii's role in regional trade. On one hand, amphorae from the site bear marks showing imports from Spain, Greece, and the Near East, suggesting that Pompeii was plugged into Mediterranean exchange networks. On the other, much of its economy seems geared toward local needs, supplying the surrounding countryside and smaller towns rather than functioning as a major export hub. The debate matters because it frames Pompeii's identity. Was it primarily a local service centre, sustained by agricultural hinterlands, or a regional port trading across the sea? The evidence remains balanced, and so Pompeii sits ambiguously between these models, embodying both the intimacy of neighbourhood commerce and the reach of imperial networks. What ties all of these threads together is the sense of vibrancy. Pompeii's economic life was dense and layered. Bakeries grinding flour, bars ladling out wine and beans, workshops hammering bronze, laundries whitening cloth, and graffiti weaving business with politics. Streets carried not only carts, but also the sounds and smells of trade, binding together daily life in a fabric of labour and exchange. These were the spaces where Pompeians spent much of their time, sustaining themselves, meeting neighbours, and participating in the civic rhythms of their city. From these markets and shops, it is only a short step to the food they produced and consumed, the meals that nourished Pompeii's people, and preserved in waste and ashes, still tell us what filled their tables when the city fell silent. The economy of Pompeii fed directly into its kitchens and taverns, and the evidence of what people ate survives in surprising detail. Excavations of drains, cesspits and latrines have yielded a catalogue of discarded bones, shells and seeds that reconstructs the diet of a Roman town. Among the most telling finds are the remains of small songbirds, a delicacy reserved for wealthier tables. Their fragile bones appear alongside fish, sea urchins and oysters, showing that Pompeians had access to both terrestrial and marine resources. Archaeologists can identify not only the species, but also the butchery marks and charring that signal how food was prepared. Meals were varied, reflecting a cuisine shaped by geography and empire. Luxury was not limited to occasional delicacies. Evidence from kitchen assemblages shows the presence of dormus, another prized dish in Roman culture. These animals were sometimes raised in special jars with air holes, fed until plump, and then roasted or stuffed. Their bones have been recovered in several Pompeian contexts, confirming that literary descriptions of their consumption were not exaggerations. Such foods required both wealth and specialized preparation, underlining how banquets became occasions to display status as well as taste. A feast was not only nourishment, but also theatre, where rare dishes signalled power and refinement to guests. At the same time, more ordinary meals have left their traces. Pigs were a staple, but the bones found in Pompeii tell a subtler story. Analysis of teeth reveals that many slaughtered animals were very young, sometimes under 3 months old, suggesting a preference for tender meat that only the affluent could afford regularly. This preference shows that diet was stratified. Elites enjoyed pork from young animals, while poorer families likely consumed older cuts or relied more heavily on cereals and legumes. The distribution of bones across houses confirms this pattern, with feasting residues clustered in larger domus and more modest remains in smaller dwellings. Diet therefore mirrored social hierarchy, reinforcing differences through the most basic act of eating. Wine too carried both universality and distinction. Amphorae recovered from Pompeii contain residues of wines imported from Spain, Greece, and the eastern Mediterranean, alongside locally produced vintages. Inscriptions and painted advertisements reveal that wine was consumed daily, but often diluted with water and flavored with herbs or resins. Archaeologists studying amphora contents have found traces of spices, suggesting recipes that blended imported and local ingredients. The presence of foreign wines highlights Pompeii's role in trade, but it also underscores the social meaning of consumption. Expensive imports distinguished elite banquets, while taverns served simpler, more oxidized varieties to common patrons. Drinking was as much about context as about the liquid itself. The archaeological record also exposes the social dimensions of food. Large latrine deposits in elite houses contain remains of shellfish, exotic fruits, and young pigs, confirming that feasts could be lavish. In contrast, smaller homes reveal simpler meals of bread, olives, and beans. Yet even in these humbler contexts, occasional fish bones or imported amphora fragments suggest that lower classes sometimes accessed delicacies, perhaps during festivals or through patronage. Food thus acted as both a divider and a connector, reinforcing class boundaries, while occasionally bridging them in shared experiences of celebration. Despite this richness, debates persist over the adequacy of nutrition in Pompeii. Some scholars argue that diets, even among the poor, were sufficient in protein and variety, given the availability of fish, legumes, and cereals. Others point to evidence of stunted growth and enamel defects in skeletons, which imply recurrent shortages or illnesses tied to malnutrition. The truth may lie in variation across social strata, with some families experiencing abundance while others endured scarcity. This debate matters because it reframes Pompeii not only as a city of luxury, but also as one of inequality, where access to food was shaped by wealth, connections, and geography. The picture that emerges from these traces is vivid. In one house, loaves of bread still rest carbonized in an oven, their surfaces stamped with the baker's mark. In another, amphorae stand upright in a storeroom, ready to be opened for a gathering that never came. Latrines hold the discarded shells of sea urchins, while kitchen drains preserve the bones of tiny birds prepared for a banquet. Each fragment anchors a moment of daily life, frozen in the most ordinary of acts: eating, drinking, discarding. Together they tell a story of abundance, layered with inequality, a community that celebrated through food, but also revealed its hierarchies in what it consumed. From this record of meals, the narrative now turns to the infrastructure that made such a diet possible. For behind the kitchens and taverns lay systems of water, fire, and engineering that kept Pompeii functioning until the day those same forces betrayed it. Behind the feasts and daily meals of Pompeii stood the infrastructure that made them possible, a system of water and fire designed for comfort, but also carrying hidden risks. The most visible remains are the fountains, more than 40 scattered across the city, each set at a crossroads or near busy quarters. Their stone basins still show the grooves carved by centuries of vessels being placed and lifted, proof of how essential they were to daily life. These fountains were supplied by aqueducts that brought water from the hills, channeling it through lead pipes into the city and distributing it by a complex web of conduits. The network allowed not only public fountains, but also many houses to enjoy running water, a feature that astonishes modern visitors who expect such convenience to be a recent invention. Pompeii's plumbing reflects the sophistication of Roman engineering, bringing fresh water directly into the urban fabric. The same system extended into the city's baths, some of the most sophisticated buildings preserved. The Stabian baths, among the oldest, combine a sequence of rooms where bathers moved from cold to warm to hot environments. Ingeniously designed furnaces, or hypercausts, circulated heated air beneath raised floors and behind hollow walls, allowing water to be warmed and rooms to maintain stable temperatures. Floors rested on stacks of small brick pillars that carried the heat, and archaeologists still find soot deposits where fires once burned. These facilities were not private luxuries, but public institutions, open to citizens of various classes and frequented daily. The baths embody how Pompeians balanced hygiene, leisure, and social interaction in spaces powered by a marriage of fire and water. Pipes themselves tell a more ambiguous story. Many of the lead conduits that carried water remain in place, some stamped with inscriptions naming the officials or contractors responsible for their installation. These stamps demonstrate the bureaucratic oversight of infrastructure, linking technical work with civic administration. Yet the very material of the pipes, lead, raises questions about health. Modern science shows that lead can leach into water, and scholars have long debated whether Romans suffered chronic poisoning as a result. Analyses of scale deposits inside Pompeian pipes suggest that minerals from the water quickly coated the lead, reducing direct exposure, but the risk may not have been eliminated. The debate continues, with some arguing that levels were too low to cause population-wide effects, while others see in skeletal evidence signs of long-term lead exposure. Pompeii thus reminds us that engineering achievements often carry hidden costs. The presence of water in private homes adds further nuance. Wealthy houses contained elaborate cisterns and fountains, sometimes decorated with mosaics or sculptures. In the house of the large fountain, a mosaic niched fountain once sparkled with flowing water, turning engineering into ornament. Such features were not mere utilities. They symbolized control over nature and the display of luxury. Even modest homes often had smaller installations, showing that water was integrated into the architecture of domestic life across social levels. This ubiquity blurs the line between necessity and indulgence, as the same pipes that supplied drinking water also fed decorative fountains and bath complexes. At the same time, fire was an indispensable partner in Pompeian daily life. Hearths and braziers warmed rooms and cooked meals, but they also posed risks in a city built of timber, plaster, and thatch alongside stone. Archaeologists identify charred beams from earlier fires, reminders that combustion was always a threat. In the baths, fire powered comfort. In kitchens, it produced sustenance. Yet in the eruption, heat itself became the most lethal force. The paradox of Pompeii's infrastructure lies in this duality. Systems designed to provide safety and pleasure could also contribute to danger. The study of Pompeii's water and heating systems offers more than technical curiosity. It shows how an ancient city managed resources with remarkable ingenuity, integrating aqueducts, pipes, fountains, cisterns, furnaces, and drains into a coherent whole. It also reveals the tensions between innovation and risk. Lead pipes delivering water that might harm, fires providing heat that could destroy, reliance on aqueducts that trembled during earthquakes. The infrastructure of Pompeii embodied Roman ambition to master environment and enhance daily life, but its traces also remind us that mastery was never absolute. From these systems of comfort and risk, the story shifts naturally to the public arena, where water and fire were transmuted into spectacle. The amphitheatre, where blood, sweat, and sand defined another dimension of Pompeian existence. The amphitheatre at Pompeii rises at the edge of the city like a monument to both engineering and appetite, a structure built to channel the energies of thousands into a single arena. It is the earliest known stone amphitheatre in the Roman world, constructed around 70 BCE, and its form set a model for later venues across the empire. Unlike Greek theatres, which offered semicircular seating for plays, the amphitheatre presented a full ellipse, allowing spectators to surround spectacles on all sides. With capacity for some 20,000 people, far more than Pompeii's estimated population. It served not only the town, but also the surrounding countryside, a regional hub for entertainment that combined sport, ritual, and violence. Seating arrangements within the amphitheatre reveal the rigid hierarchies of Roman society. Archaeological evidence and literary parallels show that men of high status occupied the best positions near the arena floor, where proximity magnified prestige. Behind them sat ordinary citizens, while women, slaves, and the poor were relegated to the upper tiers. The architecture itself enforced these divisions, with separate stairways and entrances guiding each group to its allotted place. Inscriptions and graffiti further confirm the importance of these distinctions, with names of local magistrates and benefactors associated with particular sections. To sit in a certain seat was to be visible as much as to see. The amphitheatre was therefore a civic mirror, reflecting social order in stone steps and stairwells. Inside the arena, gladiatorial combat took centre stage. Graffiti across Pompeii names fighters, records victories, and celebrates their skill as if they were celebrities. Some images scratched into plaster depict specific types of gladiators: the rhetarius, armed with net and trident, light and agile; the murmillo, heavily armoured with sword and shield; the secutor, designed to counter the net fighter with a smooth helmet that resisted entanglement. These depictions are not random doodles, but deliberate acts of admiration, evidence that Pompeians followed gladiators with the same fervour modern fans reserve for athletes. Fighters were often slaves or prisoners, yet success could bring fame and even the possibility of freedom, making them figures of both pity and admiration. The spectacle itself was not unbroken savagery, but a structured performance. Combat followed rules, referees enforced standards, and outcomes depended not only on strength, but also on skill. Wooden swords awarded to retiring gladiators, mosaics depicting elaborate duels, and graffiti celebrating favourite fighters all attest to a culture that saw these contests as more than executions. The amphitheatre was an arena of sport, discipline and identity, where bravery and technique mattered as much as blood. To the crowd, victories brought pride, and defeats carried the thrill of danger. To the fighters, survival and acclaim hung in precarious balance. Historians continue to debate whether women ever fought in Pompeii's amphitheatre. Some inscriptions and rare images elsewhere in the empire suggest female gladiators, while most evidence points to male dominance of the arena. The debate underscores how incomplete the record remains, and how much interpretation must rest on fragmentary data. If women did fight, their presence would have been exceptional and heavily staged. If not, then the graffiti and art confirm the gender division of spectacle as strictly enforced. Either way, the conversation highlights the amphitheatre's role as a place where Roman norms of class and gender were dramatized before the eyes of thousands. The amphitheatre's importance was not limited to combat. It also hosted animal hunts, executions, and public gatherings. Sand covered the arena floor to absorb blood and waste, replaced regularly to maintain cleanliness and ritual purity. Awnings could be drawn over the seating to shield crowds from sun, using pulleys anchored in the stone. The logistics required to stage such events, feeding animals, training fighters, coordinating carpenters and attendants, reveal an economy of spectacle as complex as the city's bakeries or workshops. The amphitheatre was itself an industry, producing excitement and identity through careful organization. Yet the building also bore witness to conflict outside the arena. In 59 CE, a violent riot erupted between Pompeians and visitors from Nuceria during games, an event so notorious that the historian Tacitus recorded it. Bloodshed spilled beyond the arena, prompting Roman authorities to ban games in Pompeii for a decade. Archaeological evidence of this riot survives in graffiti and in traces of hurried repairs to the amphitheatre's walls. The incident reminds us that spectacles designed to contain aggression could also unleash it, showing how fragile civic order was when thousands gathered in a single charged space. What remains today is not only architecture, but also memory inscribed in walls and objects. Graffiti naming gladiators, amphorae once filled with drinks for the crowd, and bones of animals hunted in the arena all speak to the scale of entertainment. To walk the amphitheatre is to step into the echo of chants, wages, and the clash of weapons. It is to see how Romans turned violence into ritual, spectacle into identity, and architecture into a tool of power. From this theatre of blood and hierarchy, the trail of evidence leads back into quieter spaces, where walls themselves still speak, not with cheers, but with painted images that captured mythology, daily life, and the imagination of a people whose houses doubled as galleries. The walls of Pompeii preserve one of the richest archives of Roman painting anywhere, turning the city into an open gallery where private houses, shops, and villas carried art directly into daily life. Frescoes survive in astonishing numbers, their pigments shielded by ash and pumice until rediscovery. They depict gods and myths, but also gardens, banquets, still lifes, and architectural fantasies. Together they reveal not just taste, but also the mental landscapes in which Pompeii's people lived. One of the most extraordinary examples lies outside the walls in the Villa of the Mysteries. Its large triclinium, or dining room, is ringed by a continuous cycle of life-sized figures, painted in deep red backgrounds. The scenes depict Dionysian rituals, with women satyrs and maenads engaging in initiation ceremonies. Scholars debate whether these images represent an actual cult practice, or simply use Dionysian imagery to symbolize marriage and fertility. Whatever their meaning, they remind us that elite dining rooms were not only spaces for food, but also for immersion in myth. Guests reclined on couches surrounded by painted figures, blurring the line between social gathering and religious performance. Inside the city, countless houses carry frescoes in what art historians identify as 4 successive styles. The first imitated blocks of coloured marble, projecting wealth through illusion. The second expanded walls into painted architecture, columns, arches, and vistas opening onto imagined courtyards or landscapes. The third introduced delicate ornamentation, with slender columns framing miniature scenes set against monochrome backgrounds. The fourth style, prominent at the time of the eruption, combined elements of the others, blending large mythological panels with busy decorative frameworks. In Pompeii, examples of all 4 survive, providing scholars with a chronological sequence of Roman wall painting unmatched anywhere else. Within these styles, themes ranged widely. Mythological scenes adorned elite spaces, Hercules wrestling serpents, Achilles on Skyros, or Narcissus gazing at his reflection. Everyday life appeared too, still lifes of bread, figs, and jugs, or painted gardens that turned enclosed rooms into imagined landscapes. Archaeologists examining garden frescoes note that painted plants often matched species found in adjacent soil cavities, suggesting that artists extended real gardens into illusory ones, erasing the boundary between architecture and nature. This interplay between art and environment shows how Pompeians curated atmosphere, surrounding themselves with visions that amplified reality. Even modest homes carried painted walls, sometimes in simple geometric patterns, or with panels imitating coloured stone. The ubiquity of decoration reveals that frescoes were not only elite indulgences, but a cultural norm. Paint served to dignify space, no matter its size. A small workshop might have a single panel with a mythological vignette, signalling participation in shared Roman culture. The presence of painting across social levels complicates assumptions about luxury, showing that art was integral to domestic identity. Frescoes also offer glimpses of Roman fashion and daily habits. Hairstyles, garments, and furniture appear in detail, preserved in pigment. Women's elaborate coiffures, men's tunics, banquet couches, and musical instruments are rendered with accuracy that complements archaeological finds. Scenes of banquets and drinking echo the material record of amphorae and tableware. Depictions of shops and markets resonate with excavated counters and scales. The walls mirror the city itself, providing an additional layer of evidence to cross-check with physical remains. Yet scholars caution against reading all images literally. The Villa of the Mysteries cycle may not depict actual initiation rites. Still lifes may idealize abundance rather than record specific meals. Mythological scenes served symbolic purposes rather than as reflections of belief. Debate continues about whether these frescoes should be read primarily as aesthetic, religious, or social documents. The ambiguity is part of their richness. They reveal not only what Pompeians saw, but also what they wanted to see, the ideals and narratives they chose to surround themselves with. Preservation of these paintings has not been straightforward. Early excavators often detached frescoes to decorate museums, removing them from their architectural contexts. Exposure to air, rain, and pollution has damaged many that remained in situ, with colours fading or surfaces flaking. Conservationists now use lasers and other technologies to clean and stabilize them, revealing original brightness while slowing decay. The survival of such fragile art for nearly 2 millennia is itself remarkable, but it requires constant care to remain visible for future study. What the frescoes ultimately demonstrate is that Pompeii was a city of imagination, as much as stone and mortar. Its inhabitants lived in spaces where walls dissolved into gardens, where banquets unfolded under the gaze of gods, and where decoration bridged the gap between daily life and myth. These images complicate the stark narrative of destruction by reminding us of the vibrant cultural life that filled rooms before the ash. They make the city not only a place of tragedy, but also a repository of vision, taste, and creativity. From these painted interiors, the path leads outward to the temples and shrines, where Pompeians engaged with religion more formally, spaces that bound the community to gods whose favour they sought, and whose silence on the day of the eruption must have seemed unbearable. Religion in Pompeii was woven into every corner of the city, from monumental temples to the smallest shrines tucked inside kitchens. The eruption preserved both scales, allowing us to see how divine presence structured public space and private routine. Standing in the Forum, you encounter the remains of the Temple of Jupiter, dominating the northern end with its elevated podium and columns. This was more than an architectural statement. It was the civic center of religion, tying the city to the chief deity of Rome. The choice to honor Jupiter so prominently reflects Pompeii's integration into the Roman state after colonization, displaying loyalty to the gods of empire as much as to local tradition. Not far away, the Temple of Apollo speaks to deeper roots. Apollo's cult predated Roman conquest, and its presence shows continuity with earlier Italic and Greek influences in Campania. Excavations here reveal statues of Apollo and Diana, a colonnaded courtyard, and inscriptions that record dedications. The layering of styles and dedications illustrates how religion in Pompeii was never static. Old deities adapted to new contexts, blending local and imperial identities in shared rituals. Each temple was both a sacred place and a political statement, linking community identity with broader cultural currents. Alongside Jupiter and Apollo stood Venus, who held special importance for Pompeians. The Temple of Venus, near the city's southern edge, close to the harbour, indicates her role as patroness of Pompeii itself. Venus was associated with prosperity, fertility, and maritime fortune, fitting qualities for a town engaged in trade and agriculture. Statues and dedications confirm her prominence, and scholars believe that festivals in her honour may have been among the most important civic celebrations. Her temple's location by the sea symbolically tied Pompeii's fate to her protection, a reminder of how divine favour was thought to govern not just individuals, but the city's survival. Religion also lived in the household, in forms as intimate as a painted niche. Almost every house contained a lararium, a shrine to the Lares, protective spirits of the home. These shrines could be simple shelves with small terracotta figurines, or elaborate ediculi painted with vibrant colours. Scenes often show serpents coiling toward offerings, symbolizing fertility and abundance. Daily rituals at these shrines involved offerings of food and wine, binding the family to protective deities in a cycle of reciprocity. The survival of so many Luraria demonstrates how religion permeated domestic life, extending divine oversight to kitchens, courtyards, and gardens. The eruption also preserved cults that existed at the margins of official practice. One of the most enigmatic is the cult of Isis, whose temple stood in Pompeii and had been rebuilt after the earthquake of 62 CE. Its discovery in the 18th century caused a sensation, as it revealed how an Egyptian goddess found worshippers in an Italian town. Inscriptions and statues show that the cult was supported by freedmen and outsiders, suggesting it offered inclusion to groups marginalized in traditional Roman religion. Rituals involved water, music, and initiations that appealed to personal salvation. The presence of Isis in Pompeii demonstrates how religion was not only about civic order, but also about individual identity and alternative community. Religion was also written on walls. Graffiti in Pompeii records prayers, invocations, and even mockeries of gods. These informal texts, scrawled in public and private spaces, remind us that devotion was not confined to temples or shrines, but part of everyday conversation. A passerby might read an appeal to Venus, or a joke at Mercury's expense, while walking to market, illustrating how porous the boundary was between sacred and profane. What all of this reveals is a city steeped in pluralism. Jupiter, Apollo, and Venus anchored civic religion, Luraria anchored the household, Isis and other imported cults offered alternatives. The coexistence of so many deities within one small city mirrors the cosmopolitan character revealed in trade and DNA studies. Religion in Pompeii was not rigid but adaptable, absorbing influences from Rome, Greece, and Egypt into a daily rhythm that mixed grandeur with intimacy. The unanswered question is how Pompeians interpreted divine silence during the eruption. Temples collapsed, Luraria were buried, and prayers went unanswered. Archaeologists cannot know what words were spoken in those hours, but the preserved shrines and temples testify to a people accustomed to seeing gods in every aspect of life. Their destruction alongside the city underscores the catastrophe's totality. It did not just end lives and buildings, it disrupted a web of meaning that tied people to the divine. From these temples and shrines, the trail leads naturally to the language inscribed across walls and scratched into plaster, where Pompeians left behind the most personal archive of all, their graffiti. Voices still audible after 2 millennia. If frescoes revealed the imagination of Pompeians and temples, their devotion, graffiti reveal their voices, scratched or painted onto walls in charcoal, chalk, or red pigment. These casual inscriptions run through houses, shops, and public buildings. They range from political endorsements to love poems, from records of debts to vulgar jokes. Their survival owes to the ash that sealed them almost immediately after they were written, giving us one of the most direct glimpses into Roman everyday speech. Reading them is like walking through the city with its citizens whispering on every surface. One major category is electoral slogans. Walls throughout Pompeii carry endorsements of candidates for public office, written in neat block letters by professional sign painters or volunteers. These notices often specify trades or groups, bakers supporting one candidate, fullers another, innkeepers backing a third. The practice reveals how politics penetrated daily life, with private facades functioning as campaign billboards. Even homes of the wealthy bear such slogans, suggesting that owners permitted or even encouraged their walls to serve the civic process. The graffiti record electoral culture more vividly than marble inscriptions, showing a democratic texture of Roman municipal life, where the voices of guilds and shopkeepers mattered. Love and longing appear everywhere as well. Some graffiti declare affection. Marcus loves Julia, while others record brief encounters or jokes about passion. In the House of the Centenary, one inscription bluntly proclaims a man's prowess. In another quarter, a wall reads simply, "I wonder, O wall, that you have not fallen under the weight of so much scribbling." Such remarks blend tenderness, humour and satire, showing how Pompeians used walls as public diaries. These messages confirm that private emotion was not confined to letters or poetry, but spilled into the very plaster of the city. Equally abundant are insults and boasts. One tavern wall preserves an insult about a rival's laziness. Another proclaims victory in a dice game. Gladiators are named and praised, echoing the celebrity culture of the amphitheatre. Schoolboys practice the alphabet, leaving clumsy letters in corners. These inscriptions form a patchwork of learning, rivalry, and pride, recording a community alive with informal expression. For historians, the value lies not in literary polish, but in authenticity. Here are Romans speaking in their own colloquial voices, unconstrained by genre or censorship. The graffiti also reveal economic life. Tally marks record debts, lists of goods, and even menus scribbled on tavern walls. A wine shop bears inscriptions noting the price of different vintages. In one bakery, graffiti record transactions or delivery notes, as if the wall were a temporary ledger. These writings confirm what excavated amphorae and ovens already suggest. Commerce was pervasive, and writing functioned as a practical tool for managing it. Unlike the polished inscriptions of the Forum, these words were ephemeral, written quickly, often erased or overwritten. Their survival is accidental but invaluable, freezing the business chatter of ordinary days. Some graffiti verge on poetry. Short verses adapted from well-known works appear, sometimes altered to suit personal circumstances. Lines of Virgil or Ovid mingle with rougher doggerel, suggesting that education and wit were shared beyond elite circles. The boundary between literature and graffiti blurs. Walls became a medium where high culture and street humour coexisted. This mixture tells us that Roman literacy extended more widely than once thought. While not everyone could write elegantly, many could scratch a phrase or slogan enough to leave a trace that still speaks. There is debate among scholars about how broadly literacy extended in Pompeii. The sheer volume of graffiti, thousands catalogued, suggests that writing was more common than elite texts imply. Some argue that many inscriptions were written by a limited group of semi-professional scribes. Others maintain that the diversity of handwriting styles points to wide participation. The question is not settled, but the evidence at least shows a culture where writing was visible and legible to many, part of the city's social texture rather than an elite monopoly. Graffiti also map social tensions. One wall accuses a rival of theft, another mocks foreigners. Satirical comments on politicians stand beside endorsements, hinting at divisions within the community. These sharp notes counterbalance the harmony projected by temples and festivals, reminding us that Pompeii was a city of disagreements and rivalries as well as unity. They turn walls into spaces of contest, where voices clashed as well as mingled. The cumulative effect of this corpus is extraordinary. While statues and mosaics present curated images, graffiti present unfiltered immediacy. They remind you that Pompeii was not frozen as a silent ruin, but as a noisy, argumentative, affectionate, and playful city. The words on its walls speak directly across 2 millennia, bypassing formal history to deliver jokes, slogans, complaints, and loves from ordinary people. From these voices on walls, the narrative widens again to consider the moments before catastrophe, the tremors and signs that preceded the eruption, and how Pompeians may or may not have understood the warnings written not in chalk but in the ground beneath their feet. Long before ash fell on Pompeii, the earth itself signalled that life at the foot of Vesuvius was precarious. Archaeological layers show that in 62 CE, 17 years before the final eruption, a major earthquake struck the region. Buildings collapsed across the city, walls cracked, columns toppled, and infrastructure fractured. Excavations reveal hasty repairs and unfinished reconstructions in many houses, evidence that work was still ongoing when the eruption of 79 CE buried the city. Some structures were patched with cheaper materials, while others remained propped with timber supports. The earthquake thus left Pompeii in a state of transition, its architecture a mixture of ruin and renewal. To walk its streets in 79 CE was to see scaffolds and rebuilding alongside long-standing monuments, a reminder that catastrophe was not new to the town. Traces of smaller tremors appear in both literary and material records. Pliny the Younger, who later described the eruption, noted that earthquakes were frequent in the Campania region and that inhabitants had grown accustomed to them. Archaeologists have found collapsed walls and damaged mosaics repaired shortly before 79 CE, confirming ongoing seismic instability. Amphorae were found stacked in ways that suggest precaution against tremors, with shops and storerooms arranged to minimize risk of toppling. These adjustments indicate awareness, but perhaps also a fatalistic acceptance. Earthquakes were part of life, not an omen of unprecedented destruction. In the days and hours before the eruption, subtle signs may have gone unheeded. Later accounts mention animals behaving strangely, springs drying or changing taste, and tremors rattling houses. Archaeological evidence hints at such disturbances: a bakery where tools were abandoned mid-use, or amphorae knocked from shelves before the pumice fall began. Yet whether these were recognized as warnings is uncertain. Romans lacked a framework to connect tremors with volcanic eruption, seeing earthquakes as separate phenomena. To them, Vesuvius appeared a mountain like any other, its fertile slopes covered in vineyards, not a volcano poised to unleash catastrophe. The broader history of Vesuvius suggests that Pompeians lived in ignorance of its true nature. Geological studies show that the volcano had erupted violently in the distant Bronze Age, but by the 1st century CE it had lain quiet for generations. Writers like Strabo described it as a mountain with signs of past fire, but such remarks did not shape common understanding. Viticulture flourished on its slopes, producing wine famed across the empire, and settlements clustered nearby. The prosperity of the land concealed its danger. The silence of centuries lulled inhabitants into treating the mountain as ally, not threat. This combination of memory and forgetfulness is central to the mystery. Pompeians remembered earthquakes. They rebuilt after them and adapted to tremors, but they forgot or never knew that the mountain could erupt. The destruction of 62 CE was taken as a disaster of walls and roofs, not as a prelude to volcanic fury. When signs appeared in 79 CE, they were read through that lens: another quake, another disturbance, nothing more. Only when the column of pumice began to rise did the truth become undeniable. By then hours remained, but choices were constrained by habit, uncertainty, and the very architecture still under repair from the previous quake. Scholars debate how many residents left the city before the final hours. The relatively small number of casts compared with population estimates suggests that thousands fled after recognizing danger. Roads out of the city show no evidence of blockages, implying that escape was possible for many. Yet the presence of valuables left behind and the clustering of families in houses shows that others stayed, perhaps expecting to ride out the event as they had earlier quakes. The balance between flight and waiting remains unresolved, one of the most poignant uncertainties in Pompeii's story. What this block of evidence demonstrates is that Pompeii lived in the shadow of disaster long before its final day. Earthquakes shaped its buildings, tremors shook its shops, and repairs marked its streets. But without the concept of volcanology, inhabitants misread the signs. They rebuilt with vigor, planted vineyards anew, and trusted that life would continue. Their resilience, admirable in ordinary times, proved fatal when resilience was no longer enough. From these warnings, ignored or misunderstood, the narrative now returns to the eruption itself, not from the vantage of layers or bodies, but through the one eyewitness who recorded it, Pliny the Younger. whose letters provide the only surviving narrative of what it felt like to see Vesuvius explode. The eruption of 79 CE is often told through stratigraphy and casts, but it also lives in words, the testimony of Pliny the Younger, whose letters to the historian Tacitus remain the only surviving eyewitness account. At the time, Pliny was a teenager staying with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum across the Bay of Naples. His narrative intertwines fear, awe, and detail, a voice that humanizes the catastrophe beyond geological sequence. He describes first the site of the eruption column, a cloud rising from Vesuvius, like a pine tree, its trunk a narrow column that spread at the top into branching masses. Modern volcanologists recognize in this simile the shape of a sustained eruption plume, a description so accurate that it anchors scientific reconstructions. From Misenum, the boy watched the sky darken and ash drift across the bay. The precision of his observation shows both his literary training and the clarity with which the spectacle imprinted itself on memory. Pliny's uncle, the elder, chose not to flee but to sail toward the danger, motivated partly by duty to rescue friends and partly by scientific curiosity. His nephew records how the fleet rode into thickening ash and falling pumice, how boats risked grounding in the shallows as debris filled the sea. Pliny the Elder attempted to reach Stabiae, south of Pompeii, where he stayed with a friend, but the next morning he collapsed, overcome by fumes. His death, witnessed by companions, became emblematic of Rome's intellectual courage, a naturalist and commander who sought to study and to save, undone by the very forces he wished to understand. The Younger's account preserves not only the death, but also the motive, blending personal grief with a portrait of devotion to knowledge. Meanwhile, Pliny the Younger himself remained at Misenum, where fear spread through the population as earthquakes shook buildings and ash thickened in the air. He recalls how people debated whether to flee inland or remain by the sea, uncertain which danger was greater. Torches flickered in constant tremors, cries filled the streets, and mothers clutched infants. The detail of psychological confusion, the weighing of dangers, the panic of families, makes his letter unique in ancient literature, one of the few places where collective fear is described in real time. He recounts how daylight was swallowed by darkness, thicker than any night, pierced only by fire and lightning around the mountain. The air filled with pumice and stones, striking heads and shoulders. People tied pillows on their heads as makeshift helmets, improvising protection against falling debris. The image of ordinary objects turned to armor conveys both desperation and ingenuity. This detail resonates with archaeological finds of collapsed roofs and pumice-filled rooms, linking text to material record. Pliny also captures the existential dread. People bewailed their own fate, or that of their relatives, and some even prayed for death in their terror of dying. The words convey a spectrum of reactions: despair, resignation, and fleeting courage. His account reminds us that the disaster was not only geological, but also psychological, a crisis of meaning as much as of survival. What makes these letters so valuable is their intersection with evidence on the ground. The pine tree plume he saw matches deposits of pumice in Pompeii. The 6 surges described by volcanologists align with the moments when Misenum shook and darkness deepened. His description of falling pumice and collapsing roofs mirrors the archaeological record of destroyed houses. The correspondence between word and stone reinforces the reliability of both sources, each illuminating the other. Yet the letters also raise questions. Pliny does not describe Pompeii directly. His vantage point was across the bay, and his focus was on Misenum and Stabiae. His silence about the fate of Pompeii is conspicuous, a reminder that our only contemporary narrative is partial. Tacitus's request for the account shows that even within decades, curiosity about the event was strong, but the absence of other voices leaves gaps that archaeology must fill. Scholars debate how much Pliny's literary training shaped his account, whether the similes and dramatizations reflect reality or rhetorical style. The pine tree plume, for instance, may be both observation and poetic device. These uncertainties remind us that memory and language mediate disaster as much as layers of ash do. The letters became foundational centuries later when rediscovered in manuscripts. Renaissance scholars cited them as examples of elegant Latin style, long before geology read them as evidence. Only in the modern era did scientists reframe them as data for volcanic eruptions. Today, volcanologists use his timing of phases, his descriptions of cloud shape, and his notes on tremors to model eruption dynamics. Thus a teenager's memory, written as a letter to a friend, became a cornerstone of modern volcanology, bridging literature and science. Pliny's testimony leaves us with paradox. He saw clearly yet incompletely. He described accurately yet rhetorically. He conveyed fear yet survived to narrate. His words remind us that Pompeii's destruction was not only a natural event, but also a human experience, recorded by eyes that trembled as much as the ground. From this solitary voice, the narrative expands again to the silence of centuries that followed, when the city lay buried, forgotten, and then by chance rediscovered, beginning another chapter of its long afterlife. After the ash settled and the fires went out, Pompeii disappeared from memory. For more than 1500 years, the city lay buried under meters of volcanic material, its name fading into obscurity, while legends and fragments of knowledge lingered. Medieval chronicles occasionally mentioned ruins called La Civita, the city, but they did not connect it with Pompeii of antiquity. Farmers ploughed fields over the hardened ash, vineyards spread across the land, and entire generations lived unaware that beneath their feet rested streets, houses, and human forms sealed in silence. The rediscovery was gradual, shaped by accident and curiosity rather than design. In the late 16th century, workers digging a canal near the river Sarno uncovered inscriptions and walls that hinted at an ancient settlement. At first, attention focused on Herculaneum, uncovered in 1709, when labourers stumbled upon a theatre while digging a well. Systematic tunnelling followed, commissioned by the Bourbon kings of Naples, who sought treasures to adorn their palaces. Pompeii entered this story in 1748, when excavations revealed the first recognisable remains of the buried town. Initially, the goal was not archaeology in the modern sense, but treasure hunting. Statues, frescoes, and artifacts were removed to decorate collections, their contexts often ignored. Over time, the significance of the finds became undeniable. Streets emerged in alignment, houses with intact walls, frescoes still vivid. Scholars began to realize that Pompeii offered something unique, a city frozen at a specific moment. Unlike Rome, continually inhabited and rebuilt, Pompeii remained suspended in time. Every discovery added to the sense of wonder, from loaves of bread preserved in ovens to graffiti preserved on plaster. By the 19th century, Pompeii had become a laboratory of archaeology, shaping the discipline itself. Methods of recording, preserving, and interpreting material culture were tested here before spreading elsewhere. Excavations in the 18th and 19th centuries were uneven. Some areas were cleared hastily, leaving walls exposed to rain and air that damaged them. Others were documented more carefully, with drawings and descriptions that still serve as references today. The work of Giuseppe Fiorelli in the mid-19th century marked a turning point. He introduced a grid system for excavation, dividing the city into regions and insulae blocks that remain the framework for archaeological mapping. He also pioneered the plaster casting technique that captured the forms of victims, transforming hollow voids into human figures. Fiorelli's methods shifted Pompeii from treasure trove to scientific site, though even then the balance between spectacle and scholarship was delicate. The rediscovery of Pompeii profoundly shaped European culture. Artists, writers, and travellers flocked to see the ruins. The city became a symbol of mortality and preservation, inspiring romantic reflections on time and catastrophe. Painters depicted Pompeian scenes with imagination fueled by newly uncovered frescoes. Writers such as Edward Bulwer Lytton turned the city into fiction in the last days of Pompeii, blending historical detail with melodrama. Tourism grew, with travelers on the Grand Tour, including Pompeii as a crucial stop, walking streets where ancient ruts and frescoes blurred the line between past and present. Yet the same fame that drew admiration also threatened the site. Exposure to air and human contact damaged frescoes and walls, while looting persisted despite official oversight. Rain eroded exposed structures. Plants and roots penetrated cracks. In some cases, early conservation efforts worsened decay. Coatings of oil or wax intended to protect paintings instead darkened and corroded them over time. The paradox of rediscovery was clear. To unearth Pompeii was also to endanger it. Archaeologists faced the constant dilemma of whether to excavate more or to preserve what was already uncovered. Scholarly debates accompanied the rediscovery. Some argued that the site should be left partially buried to protect it, while others pressed for full exposure to satisfy curiosity and research. Over the centuries, priorities shifted. The early hunger for artifacts gave way to interest in daily life, economy, and society. Excavators began cataloguing graffiti, analysing food remains, and reconstructing houses. The focus moved from spectacular finds to the ordinary traces that revealed how Pompeians lived. This change in perspective transformed archaeology itself, emphasizing context and interpretation over display. Despite progress, mysteries remain about how much of Pompeii is still hidden. Roughly a third of the city has never been excavated, lying beneath layers of ash and earth. Some scholars argue that leaving it buried is the best preservation, protecting fragile materials until techniques improve. Others call for continued excavation to answer lingering questions about population, economy, and social structure. The debate encapsulates Pompeii's modern paradox. It is both an archaeological treasure and a fragile ruin, threatened by the very curiosity it inspires. What the rediscovery ultimately achieved was to bridge centuries of silence. It turned a forgotten town into one of the most studied ancient sites on Earth, a place where art, architecture, and human remains tell stories in unparalleled detail. At the same time, it raised questions about responsibility, how to balance knowledge with preservation, spectacle with science. Pompeii's second life, begun with chance digs and royal treasure hunts, evolved into a global project of memory. From the story of rediscovery, the path now turns to preservation in the modern era, how archaeologists, scientists, and conservators struggle to keep the city intact under new threats of weather, tourism, and time itself. Once unearthed, Pompeii faced a new kind of danger: survival in the modern world. The ash and pumice that had entombed the city for centuries had also protected it, sealing frescoes in darkness and shielding walls from rain and wind. Exposure reversed that protection. As roofs collapsed and plaster crumbled, the city began to erode in ways the eruption had never caused. Archaeology itself became both salvation and threat, rescuing Pompeii from oblivion, but placing it at the mercy of weather, vegetation, and the touch of millions of visitors. By the 20th century, concern about preservation had grown acute. Scholars noted that frescoes uncovered in the 18th century had already faded beyond recognition. Colours that once dazzled with reds and blues had dulled or flaked away. In some cases, frescoes vanished entirely, leaving only descriptions or watercolours made by earlier recorders. The lesson was stark. Excavation without protection was destruction. This realization shifted priorities. Instead of rushing to reveal the entire city, archaeologists began to weigh whether to leave sections buried until conservation methods improved. Even today, a third of Pompeii remains under ash, not through neglect, but as deliberate preservation. Modern conservation combines science with craft. Lasers are now used to clean wall paintings, removing soot and biological growth without damaging pigment. Microscopic analysis identifies salts that crystallize inside plaster, causing surfaces to detach. Conservators applied breathable mortars to stabilize walls, ensuring that repairs expand and contract with the original materials. Techniques like 3D scanning and photogrammetry create digital records that capture details before they deteriorate. Each fresco and inscription can now exist in both physical and virtual form, a hedge against inevitable decay. Tourism, while vital to public awareness and funding, adds another layer of risk. Millions of visitors walk Pompeii's streets every year, brushing against walls, touching counters, and wearing down paving stones. Even the presence of breath and moisture contributes to the degradation of enclosed spaces. Authorities have struggled to balance access with protection, closing some houses while opening others in rotation. Wooden walkways and barriers attempt to channel visitors without diminishing the sense of walking through a real city. The challenge is constant, to share Pompeii with the world while preventing the world from overwhelming Pompeii. Weather compounds these pressures. Rain infiltrates walls and foundations, particularly in winter. Freeze-thaw cycles fracture stones. Vegetation grows in cracks, its roots prying apart ancient masonry. Earthquakes still shake the region, causing collapses in already fragile structures. In 2010, the house of the gladiators collapsed after heavy rain, sparking international alarm. The incident symbolized the vulnerability of the site and prompted renewed efforts to stabilize it. Preservation became not only an academic concern, but a political and cultural one, with the European Union and Italian government funding large-scale conservation projects. One of the most ambitious initiatives in recent years has been the Grande Progetto Pompeii, launched in 2012 with hundreds of millions of euros dedicated to restoration, drainage, monitoring, and digital recording. Teams of engineers, archaeologists, and conservators work block by block, repairing walls, strengthening roofs, and implementing systems to channel rainwater away from vulnerable areas. Sensors now monitor ground movement, while satellites track subtle shifts in terrain. These measures combine ancient masonry with modern technology, fusing the old city with 21st century science. Yet preservation is not only about walls and frescoes, it is about context. Early excavations removed artifacts for museums, scattering objects across Europe. Today, emphasis lies on keeping items in situ whenever possible, allowing visitors to see houses with their amphorae, counters with their jars, and gardens replanted with ancient species. The House of the Vetii, reopened after long restoration, exemplifies this approach. Frescoes cleaned to brilliance, gardens reconstructed, and rooms displayed as coherent spaces rather than isolated fragments. Preservation now means recreating atmosphere as much as stabilizing stone. There is also debate about authenticity. How much should be reconstructed, and how much left in ruin? Some scholars argue for minimal intervention, letting collapsed walls remain as testimony to fragility. Others support careful reconstruction to convey a sense of what once was. Both approaches coexist in Pompeii. Some houses stand roofless, their frescoes faded but untouched, while others have been restored to evoke their original splendor. Visitors move between ruin and recreation, experiencing both the rawness of survival and the imagination of restoration. Despite all efforts, Pompeii cannot be frozen forever. Time continues its work, and every year brings losses alongside discoveries. Preservation is therefore also about documentation. High-resolution photography, 3D scans, and digital models ensure that when frescoes fade or walls collapse, records remain. Virtual Pompeii becomes a parallel city, one that future generations can study even if the physical site changes. The paradox deepens. The city that survived because it was buried now survives by being digitally reborn. What ties these efforts together is recognition of Pompeii's unique role. It is not merely an archaeological site, but a cultural symbol, a reminder of mortality, resilience, and memory. To preserve it is to preserve not only Roman history, but also modern reflection on time and loss. The challenges of conservation, rain, roots, tourists, neglect, are the contemporary echoes of the catastrophe of 79 CE. The eruption buried Pompeii. Our age must prevent its slow erosion. From the struggle to preserve, the story moves into the realm of science, where new technologies, CT scans, DNA sequencing, and geochemical analysis push beyond conservation to unlock secrets of the people themselves, giving faces, diets, and identities to those once frozen in ash. In the last few decades, Pompeii has become not only a place of excavation, but also a laboratory where science interrogates the past, with tools undreamed of by earlier archaeologists. The plaster casts of victims, created in the 19th century, long served as haunting reminders of final moments. Faces contorted, arms outstretched, families huddled together. But today these casts are more than visual relics. They are scanned, x-rayed, and analyzed to extract information about age, health, and even diet. What once was a silent shape in plaster has become a source of data that speaks about the people inside the ash. Computer tomography, or CT scanning, has revolutionized this process. By passing casts through medical-grade scanners, researchers can peer inside without breaking them open. Beneath the plaster, bones remain intact, their density and morphology preserved. Analyses reveal the ages of victims, from infants to the elderly, and their sex, discerned through pelvis shape or skull features. Dental studies show wear patterns and cavities, giving clues about diet rich in bread and fruit, but also abrasive from stone fragments and flour. One well-preserved individual was identified as a man in his 20s who carried a sword, suggesting he may have been a soldier or guard. The reconstruction of his face, using digital modeling, gives startling immediacy to a life ended nearly 2 millennia ago. DNA analysis has also begun to reshape understanding. The 2022 study successfully sequenced the genome of one Pompeian victim, revealing ancestry that included both local Italian and Eastern Mediterranean components. This aligns with broader evidence of Pompeii's cosmopolitan character, where trade and migration mingled populations. Genetic data also show markers of disease. Tuberculosis, for example, appears in bone lesions and DNA fragments. Such findings bring medicine into the story, showing not only how Pompeians lived and died in 79 CE, but also what illnesses afflicted them in life. Science extends beyond casts to skeletons found in Herculaneum, where pyroclastic surges preserved entire groups by the seashore. Studies of their bones reveal muscular stress markers, indicating labor-intensive lives, and chemical analyses detect diets heavy in seafood, compared with the more terrestrial diet of Pompeii. Isotopic examination of teeth shows where individuals spent their childhood, confirming mobility within the empire. Together, these techniques demonstrate that the eruption preserved not just architecture, but also biological archives of Roman bodies. Even the humble latrine and sewer have become sources of revelation. Microscopic examination of waste layers identifies seeds, fish bones, and pollen grains, reconstructing diets in extraordinary detail. At one site, archaeologists found remains of sea urchins, songbirds, and young pigs, delicacies that point to elite feasts just before the eruption. Parasite eggs detected in latrine sediments show that intestinal worms were common, a reminder that sanitation, though advanced for its time, was still imperfect. What people ate, how they prepared food, and what ailments plagued them can now be charted from soil once dismissed as mere refuse. Technology also transforms how buildings are studied. Laser scanning and photogrammetry create precise 3D models of entire insulae, recording every crack and surface. These models allow scholars to trace construction phases, identify repairs after earthquakes, and simulate the appearance of houses before collapse. In some cases, digital reconstructions reveal how sunlight entered atria at specific times of day, or how traffic patterns shaped streetwear. Tablets in the field replaced notebooks, letting archaeologists record data in situ and compare it instantly with earlier maps. The result is a city more thoroughly documented than at any time in its long afterlife. One striking application has been the study of infrastructure. Portable scanners reveal hidden sewers, mapping the arteries beneath streets without excavation. Analysis of stepping stones and wheel ruts shows patterns consistent with a system of one-way streets, an ancient traffic regulation confirmed only by modern technology. Such findings transform our view of Pompeii from picturesque ruin to functioning organism, a city that managed complexity with surprising sophistication. Not all technological revelations confirm assumptions. Some overturn them. For years, a large building near the theatre was thought to be gladiators' barracks. Yet portable 3D scans of its sewers and latrines, combined with analysis of its decoration, suggest it was more likely a market hall or public facility. Here, technology not only documents, but challenges received wisdom, reminding us that Pompeii still resists full understanding. The most tantalizing scientific frontier lies in texts. In nearby Herculaneum, carbonized papyrus scrolls from a villa library have long frustrated scholars, crumbling when unrolled. Now, powerful synchrotron X-rays and machine learning algorithms attempt to read ink sealed within. Early results show faint words and phrases, hinting that entire lost works of philosophy may yet be recovered. Though not strictly Pompeian, these efforts belong to the same catastrophe and highlight how science might return voices silenced for 2 millennia. Science has thus given Pompeians new lives, faces reconstructed, genomes sequenced, diets charted, diseases diagnosed, traffic patterns modelled, libraries whispered back to light. Yet each revelation deepens the mystery as well, showing how much remains unknown. For every identified individual, hundreds remain nameless. For every meal reconstructed, countless others are lost. The paradox endures. Technology brings clarity and exposes absence at the same time. From these scientific insights into bodies, bones, and scrolls, the narrative must return to the living city as a whole, to the urban fabric that held all these lives together, its streets, neighborhoods, and rhythms. A portrait of Pompeii, not as a ruin, but as a city once bustling with motion. To imagine Pompeii fully, one must step back from its individual houses, temples, and victims, and see it as a city, a network of streets, neighborhoods, and institutions that gave coherence to everyday life. Archaeologists have mapped its 66 hectares with meticulous care, showing an urban organism both typical of Roman towns and distinctive in its local adaptations. Walking its streets, whether in person or in digital reconstructions, reveals how space structured relationships, movements, and opportunities. The city's grid is striking in its clarity, laid out in insulae, rectangular blocks separated by paved roads. Pompeii reflects Roman planning, yet its layout also preserves traces of earlier pre-Roman phases. Streets are not perfectly straight, but adjust to topography, curving slightly where the terrain demanded. At intersections, raised stepping stones allowed pedestrians to cross above water and waste flowing in the gutters, while ruts carved into paving stones show where carts passed for centuries. Modern analysis of these ruts reveals patterns consistent with one-way traffic, suggesting that city officials managed congestion and flow much as urban planners do today. The streets were arteries through which the city pulsed, carrying people, goods, and ideas. Neighborhoods within Pompeii reveal diversity. The Forum served as political and commercial heart, flanked by temples, basilica, and markets. To the east, the amphitheatre and palestra marked zones of spectacle and exercise, where crowds gathered for entertainment. Residential quarters varied in character. Some insulae held elite houses with atria and peristyles, others clustered workshops and taverns. The coexistence of grandeur and modesty is one of Pompeii's most distinctive features. Unlike many ancient cities where elite quarters are isolated, Pompeii shows rich and poor living side by side, their walls literally touching. Archaeologists studying waste deposits and graffiti in such mixed neighborhoods argue that this proximity fostered a dynamic social texture where artisans, merchants, and aristocrats interacted daily. Infrastructure underpinned this complexity. The aqueduct fed public fountains, distributed so evenly that no household was far from fresh water. Public baths punctuated neighborhoods, serving not just hygiene, but also sociability. Drainage channels carried runoff, though blockages and repairs suggest maintenance struggles common to all cities. Evidence of street vendors, stalls, and corner shops shows that the public sphere was not confined to monuments, but extended into thresholds and pavements. Pompeii's urbanism was less about monumental grandeur than about integration, where temples, taverns, and houses shared the same grid. The Forum encapsulates this blend of order and plurality. Surrounded by colonnades, it housed the Temple of Jupiter, the Basilica for legal matters, and Masella for trade. Statues honored magistrates and benefactors, their inscriptions recording names still legible. Yet alongside this civic dignity, graffiti crowd the walls, turning even the grandest square into a canvas of jokes, endorsements, and personal notes. The Forum thus functioned both as stage of Roman authority and as marketplace of voices, its stones carrying both official inscriptions and informal chatter. Archaeologists increasingly emphasize movement within the city. Wear on paving stones reveals not just traffic, but patterns of use. Some roads bear deeper ruts from carts repeatedly delivering goods, while others remain lighter, suggesting residential quiet. Houses opening directly onto busy streets often included shops at their entrances, blending domestic and commercial spheres. Gardens at the rear provided green space, even in dense quarters, with vineyards and orchards planted inside city walls. The impression is of a city in motion, where work, leisure, worship, and family intertwined seamlessly. Urban life also meant hazards. Fires broke out periodically, evidenced by charred beams in several houses. Earthquakes, as seen in 62 CE, forced repairs visible in patchwork masonry across the city. Noise, crowding, and odours must have filled the streets, though such sensory details survive only indirectly. Even so, the architecture testifies to resilience. Walls rebuilt, shops reopened, amphorae restacked. Pompeii was not static, but constantly adjusting to challenges, a living organism resilient until it met the force it could not withstand. The city's organization also reflects Rome's broader reach. Colonization after the social war brought Roman veterans to Pompeii, reshaping politics and architecture. Latin inscriptions replaced Oscan, though some bilingual graffiti show persistence of local identity. Roman institutions, the amphitheatre, forum, baths, imposed imperial forms, but the city retained Campanian flavours in its cuisine, art, and cults. Pompeii was thus both provincial and imperial, a hybrid space where Rome's structures met local adaptations. Today, digital technology allows scholars to reconstruct these dynamics with new precision. 3D models of entire insulae simulate how houses related to streets, how light entered rooms, and how sound travelled through atria. Simulations of traffic flow suggest how goods moved from gates to markets. Virtual reconstructions layer colours back onto walls and roofs onto open houses, showing how vibrant the city once appeared. These models confirm that Pompeii was not a ruin in life, but a fully functioning city alive with hues, sounds, and smells. The enduring mystery lies in how Pompeians themselves experienced this cityscape. Did they notice the hierarchy of seats in the amphitheatre as oppressive or natural? Did they read graffiti in the Forum as humour or insult? Did they see scaffolding after the earthquake as hopeful resilience or lingering vulnerability? Archaeology provides structures, but imagination must bridge to lived experience. What emerges is a portrait of Pompeii as more than tragedy. It was a city that worked, managed, and adapted, where infrastructure and community intersected in complex rhythms. The eruption froze those rhythms, but careful study lets them pulse again. From this urban fabric, the story turns finally to Pompeii's modern legacy, how the buried city once forgotten and then rediscovered continues to shape imagination, scholarship, and identity far beyond Italy, becoming not only a ruin but also a mirror in which each generation sees itself. The rediscovery of Pompeii did not only reshape archaeology, it reshaped imagination. From the 18th century onward, travellers on the Grand Tour carried home sketches, fragments, and stories that ignited fascination across Europe. The city frozen in ash became a cultural metaphor, a place where time itself seemed suspended. Artists, writers, and thinkers seized on Pompeii as symbol of mortality, of beauty preserved, of sudden loss, of human fragility. Its stones became more than ruins. They became mirrors in which modern societies saw their own anxieties and desires. Literature was among the first to absorb Pompeii's lesson. Edward Bulwer Lytton's The Last Days of Pompeii, 1834, turned archaeology into popular narrative, weaving characters, romance, and doom into a tale that captivated readers across Europe and America. His melodramatic vision, though historically flawed, fixed the image of Pompeii in popular imagination as a place where daily life was interrupted mid-motion. The novel inspired paintings, operas, and even later films, turning excavation into spectacle. Other writers, Dickens, Goethe, Shelley, visited the site and reflected on its silent streets, projecting onto it their own concerns with time, death, and civilization. Painters likewise found inspiration. Neoclassical canvases reimagined Pompeian interiors with bright frescoes and languid figures, blending archaeological detail with artistic fantasy. Later Romantic painters emphasized tragedy, showing crowds fleeing beneath clouds of fire, dramatizing the destruction in tones of sublime terror. In the 19th century, academic painters recreated banquets and rituals with archaeological accuracy, drawing directly from uncovered frescoes. The city became both subject and stage, a canvas onto which artists projected ideals of antiquity. Architecture and design absorbed Pompeii too. Excavated frescoes and mosaics inspired patterns in European interiors, from wall panels to floor tiles. Wealthy families commissioned Pompeian-style rooms, decorated with red and black panels, imitating those of the House of the Vetti or Villa of the Mysteries. Even garden layouts borrowed from excavated peristyles, with fountains and sculptures placed as if in Roman courtyards. The rediscovered city thus shaped not only art but also the domestic spaces of modern elites, extending its influence into everyday environments. Pompeii also became a theatre for science and spectacle in the public eye. Casts of victims, created by Fiorelli's technique, were displayed in museums, eliciting both horror and fascination. Visitors gazed on faces twisted in final agony, children clutching mothers, dogs chained and frozen mid-struggle. These casts blurred the line between archaeology and theatre, provoking reflection on mortality. In the 20th century, exhibitions of Pompeii toured globally, bringing fragments of the city to audiences in America, Japan, and beyond. Everywhere, the same effect: wonder at the preservation, unease at the catastrophe. Cinema too carried Pompeii into new media. Early silent films dramatized the eruption with special effects. Later productions reimagined it in color and sound. From Italian peplum epics to Hollywood spectacles, the fall of Pompeii became shorthand for disaster, a narrative of hubris punished and innocence destroyed. Documentaries, blending archaeology with dramatization, continued the tradition, ensuring that Pompeii remained vivid in public consciousness. But beyond art and entertainment, Pompeii shaped scholarship itself. The city provided a baseline for studying Roman urbanism, economy, and daily life. Textbooks illustrated forums and atria with Pompeian examples, Students of Latin read graffiti as windows into colloquial speech. Historians debated whether Pompeii was typical or exceptional, whether it represented a frozen moment or an unusual case shaped by disaster. Every generation of scholars returned to the site with new questions, from Marxist interpretations of class struggle in its neighborhoods to feminist readings of women's spaces in houses and baths. Pompeii became a testing ground for theories as much as for excavations. The city also became a metaphor in politics and culture. During wars and revolutions, writers invoked Pompeii as symbol of collapse, civilizations crumbling like houses under ash. In the 20th century, after atomic bombings and fears of nuclear annihilation, Pompeii's sudden destruction resonated anew. The frozen figures under ash mirrored anxieties of instant obliteration. More recently, climate change and volcanic monitoring have revived Pompeii as cautionary tale. Prosperity can vanish overnight, and nature's forces remain beyond full control. Tourism intensified this legacy. Millions walk its streets annually, experiencing the uncanny sense of time suspended. To step into Pompeii is to move between eras, seeing bread carbonized in ovens, graffiti still sharp on walls, frescoes alive with color. The site's atmosphere fosters reflection, not only on Roman life, but also on fragility of our own. Modern visitors project their fears and hopes onto its ruins, just as earlier generations did. Each century remakes Pompeii in its own image. This constant reinterpretation raises questions about authenticity. Is the Pompeii we see today the Pompeii of 79 CE, or the Pompeii of centuries of excavation, restoration, and imagination layered onto it? Scholars caution that the city is both an archaeological site and a cultural construct. Its ruins preserve reality, but every act of excavation, every restoration, every novel and painting has reshaped perception. Pompeii exists both in stone and in story. The enduring mystery of Pompeii's legacy is not whether we can reconstruct its past, but how it continues to reconstruct us. It has forced modern archaeology to evolve, inspired art and literature, provoked reflection on mortality, and warned of nature's power. Its stones echo differently in each era, yet always with resonance. From this cultural afterlife, the story narrows one final time to the question of what Pompeii means today and tomorrow, not only as ruin or museum, but as a living challenge to remember, preserve, and learn before nature or neglect erases what remains. To stand in Pompeii today is to stand between past and future. The stones underfoot carry the weight of Roman footsteps, yet the scaffolds, sensors, and digital scanners surrounding them remind us that this is also a modern project, an unfinished dialogue between archaeology and preservation. The city has survived 2 millennia only to face a new trial, whether it can be maintained against erosion, mass tourism, and the ever-present shadow of Vesuvius. What was once entombed by catastrophe now risks being lost more slowly, not in hours, but in decades. The preservation challenge is immense. Rain penetrates walls, loosening plaster and pigment. Vegetation creeps through cracks, prying stones apart. Earthquakes still rattle the region, threatening structures weakened by centuries of exposure. The collapse of the House of the Gladiators in 2010 was a wake-up call, showing how fragile the site had become. Since then, conservation projects have multiplied, but they battle against both time and scale. Pompeii is vast, and every insula, every fresco, every mosaic demands attention. Technology offers one response. High-resolution 3D scans now document entire districts, allowing scholars to preserve a digital Pompeii, even as the physical one changes. Satellites track ground movement, alerting researchers to potential landslides or collapses. Lasers clean frescoes without damaging paint. Virtual reality reconstructions restore color to walls and roofs to houses, allowing visitors to see the city as it once was. These tools expand preservation beyond material repair. creating parallel versions of Pompeii that may outlast stone and plaster. Yet they also raise philosophical questions. Will future generations know Pompeii through ruins or through simulations, and how will that change its meaning? Another challenge is balancing access with protection. Millions of visitors walk Pompeii each year, their curiosity sustaining funding, but also accelerating decay. Authorities rotate access, closing some houses for restoration while reopening others. Walkways and barriers direct traffic, but the essence of Pompeii, its streets, its openness, resists confinement. The very experience that makes the site unique, walking freely through an ancient city, is what endangers it. Each solution is a compromise between education, tourism, and conservation. Beyond practical matters lies the question of Vesuvius itself. The volcano that destroyed Pompeii is still active, monitored daily by seismographs and satellites. Civil defense plans exist for evacuation of hundreds of thousands should it erupt again. Scholars warn that history could repeat itself, though in a different form, not an ancient town buried, but modern cities threatened. Pompeii thus serves as a reminder that nature's cycles outlast human memory. Its preservation is shadowed by the same force that once obliterated it. Yet Pompeii's significance transcends geology. It has become a mirror for humanity's relationship with time, memory, and fragility. For archaeologists, it is a record of Roman daily life, unmatched in detail. For artists, it is a symbol of sudden loss and beauty preserved. For tourists, it is a haunting encounter with lives interrupted mid-motion. For scientists, it is a case study in disaster and resilience. Every perspective adds to its meaning, and every generation reinterprets it. The mystery that lingers is not only about how Pompeians lived and died, but about how we live with their memory. What do we choose to preserve? What do we allow to fade? And how do we balance curiosity with responsibility? Pompeii poses these questions not abstractly, but concretely. In every wall that crumbles, every fresco that flakes, every inscription that fades under new light. Perhaps that is Pompeii's final lesson. The eruption froze a moment in time, but the rediscovery has created another, a continuous negotiation between past and present. To study Pompeii is to confront both the endurance and the fragility of human achievement. Streets that once echoed with carts now echo with tourists. Walls once scribbled with graffiti now carry conservation scaffolds. The city endures, yet never unchanged. What endures most powerfully are the faces and gestures of those caught in ash. Parents shielding children, workers clutching tools, animals straining at chains. Their forms remind us that beneath the grandeur of temples and the complexity of sewers, Pompeii was a city of individuals, each with fears, hopes, and routines. Their final moments, preserved by chance, continue to speak across millennia. As you leave Pompeii, whether in person or through words, you carry more than facts. You carry the weight of an ancient city still asking questions. How do we live knowing everything can end in an instant? How do we remember without destroying what we study? How do we prepare for forces beyond our control? These questions, unanswered, are the true mysteries of Pompeii. And so the city remains, half ruin, half revelation, an archive of both ancient Rome and modern humanity's search for meaning in its ashes.